Clara Whitfield dropped to her knees in the dirt right there at the gate. Not from weakness, from intention. She pressed her palms flat against the dry Montana ground and looked up at the man who held the last door she had left to knock on. "I will work for food if that's all you're giving," she said. And her voice didn't shake once. "But please, don't turn me away." Caleb Dawson stared down at her for a long moment. Hat pulled, low, jaw set like carved stone. Then he said 4 words that changed everything she thought she knew about what she was asking for. "I need a wife. If this story already has you holding your breath, subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels." The last thing Clara Whitfield expected to do on the morning of July 14th, 1876, was beg. She had been raised by a woman who said begging was the one thing a Whitfield would never do. Not even if the wolves were at the door. Her mother had said that with such conviction, such iron in her spine, that Clara had believed it for 26 years. Through hunger and hardship and loss, she had believed it. But her mother was dead now. The house was gone. The relatives were gone. And Clara had been walking for 3 days in boots that had worn through at the heel, carrying a suitcase with one broken latch that she held shut with her left hand because her right hand needed to stay free in case she needed to defend herself on the road. When she saw the gate of the Dawson Ranch rise up out of the flat plains of eastern Montana, something in her chest cracked open like a fault line. Not relief, not hope, just the recognition that this was the last stop. There was no more road after this. There was no more plan. She stopped at the gate and stood there for a full minute, gathering herself. The ranch hand who spotted her first was a young man named Eddie Pruitt, barely 19, who had the kind of open face that still showed every thought moving through it. He came to the fence post and squinted at her like he wasn't sure she was real. "You need something, ma'am?" Clara set her suitcase down in the dust. "I need to speak with Mr. Dawson." Eddie looked her over. The worn dress, the road dirt on her face, the careful, controlled stillness that people develop when they've been carrying too much for too long and can't afford to let any of it show. "Mr. Dawson don't usually take meetings at the gate," he said. "Not unkind." "I'm not asking for a meeting," Clara said. "I'm asking for work." Something shifted in Eddie's expression. He glanced back toward the main house, then back at her. "Wait here," he said. She waited. She stood in the heat without moving to the shade because she didn't want to look like she was making herself comfortable anywhere she hadn't been invited. She counted her breaths. She kept her hands still at her sides. She did not let herself think about what would happen if the answer was no. Caleb Dawson came out of the barn, not the house. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He was working, in the middle of the morning, on a ranch that employed 20 men. The owner was in the barn with his sleeves rolled up and his hat pulled down against the sun. And he came to the gate himself, without any particular hurry, wiping his hands on a cloth that he tucked into his back pocket when he stopped in front of her. He was taller than she'd expected. Not a soft man. Not a cruel one either, from what she could see in his face. Though that could be wrong. His eyes were gray and direct, and gave nothing away freely. "Eddie says you're looking for work," he said. "Yes." "Sir, what kind?" Clara lifted her chin. "Any kind that's honest." "I can cook, I can keep house, I can manage accounts if you need them. Managed my father taught me figures, and I've kept ledgers before. I can sow, preserve, garden. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't make complaints, and I don't cause trouble." She stopped, drew one breath. "I'm a good worker, Mr. Dawson. I only need the chance to show you." He studied her. Not in a way that made her feel small, more like he was reading something written in a language he didn't quite trust himself to translate yet. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Billings." "That's a long walk." "Yes, sir, it is." "Why here?" "There are ranches between Billings and here." Clara held his gaze. Because I asked around and every person I asked said that Caleb Dawson was a fair man who paid a fair wage and didn't have a reputation for making his workers' lives difficult. That's rarer than it ought to be. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one. You know anything about what this ranch runs? He asked. Cattle, primarily. Some horses. You've got about 2,000 head if the numbers from last county record are still accurate. Though I'd wager it's closer to 2,200 by now, given the grazing land you hold south of the creek. She watched his eyes. I pay attention to things. It's a habit. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you staying?" "Nowhere," Clara said plainly. "I used the last of my money on food 2 days ago. I've been sleeping under whatever shelter the road offered." He didn't flinch at that. Didn't look away. Didn't soften either. He just looked at her with those direct gray eyes and said, "What happened to you?" It wasn't a prying question. It was asked with the same practical directness as everything else he'd said. Like he was simply trying to understand the shape of the situation in front of him. Clara could have deflected, could have kept it professional and clean and impersonal. Instead, she heard herself say the truth. "My father died 18 months ago. The farm went to creditors. My uncle took me in on the condition that I would work for my keep, which I did, for 14 months without complaint. Then my cousin decided he had other ideas about my situation. And when I refused, my uncle put me out of the house and told everyone in 3 counties that I was an ungrateful, troublemaking woman who couldn't be trusted." She kept her voice even. "I am not those things. But I also understand that I can't prove it by standing here telling you so. I can only prove it by working." The silence that followed was long enough that she heard a horse shift in the barn behind him. Somewhere farther off, 2 of the ranch hands were arguing about something in low voices. The words too distant to make out. Then Caleb Dawson said, "I don't need a worker, Miss Clara." Her stomach dropped. She braced herself. "I need a wife." The words landed so far outside of anything she'd prepared herself for, that for a moment she couldn't process them. She stared at him. He looked back at her with the same calm, unreadable expression he'd had since he walked through the gate. "I beg your pardon," she said. "This ranch runs well," he said. "I've got good men and solid operations. What it doesn't have is someone who can manage the household with any real authority. Run the domestic accounts, handle the correspondence, manage the kitchen properly, and keep everything together in a way that makes this place feel like something other than a bunkhouse with a better roof." He paused. "I've been looking for someone who could do all of that. The problem is, the position I'm describing isn't really a housekeeper's position. And I can't offer what I'm describing as employment to an unmarried woman without causing her a great deal of social difficulty. Which means what I actually need, practically speaking, is a wife." Clara stared at him. "You're proposing to me. I'm explaining a situation," he said. "You can call it what you want. We've been speaking for approximately 4 minutes. I'm aware of that. You don't know anything about me. I know you walked from Billings on broken boots and didn't lead with asking for charity. I know you tracked down public county records to get a sense of the operation before you came here. I know you told me the truth when you didn't have to." He paused. "I don't need to know everything about a person to recognize their character. And I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to think practically about a practical situation." Clara's mind was running fast behind the careful stillness of her face. She had walked into this gate with one request: a job, a fair wage, a place to work and sleep and rebuild something from nothing. She had not walked in looking for a husband. She had not, in fact, spent any time recently thinking about marriage at all, because marriage required a certain level of stability and security and forward planning that had felt entirely out of reach for over a year. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "A practical arrangement. You run the household. You manage the domestic accounts. You handle what needs to be handled. In return, you have a home, A wage because I don't believe in a wife who has no money of her own and the legal protections that come with being Mrs. Dawson rather than a hired woman. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to pretend to be something you're not. I'm asking if this is a situation that serves both of us, and if I say no, he didn't hesitate. Then I'll ask Eddie to show you to the cook's quarters tonight and let you rest. We'll find you something to eat, and in the morning we can see if there's any honest work I can offer without putting you in a position that causes you trouble. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the angle, the trick, the thing hiding underneath his words that was going to show her what he actually wanted from this arrangement. But she couldn't find it. He was looking back at her with a directness that suggested he meant exactly what he said. No more and no less. I need to think, she said. That's fair, he said. And I need to eat something. I think better when I've eaten. Something crossed his face then. Not quite a smile, but close. That's also fair, he said. Martha Collins had been the closest thing the Dawson Ranch had to a domestic authority for the past 7 years, and she made her opinion of Clara Whitfield clear in approximately 45 seconds. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who had the posture of someone who had been standing her ground her entire life and had never once lost. When Eddie brought Clara to the kitchen, Martha looked her over from head to hem with the same thorough assessment a livestock judge gives a new animal at a county fair. Martha said. Good afternoon, Clara said. Sit down before you fall down, Martha said, which was both the least welcoming and most practical greeting Clara had received in some time. She put a bowl of stew in front of Clara without ceremony, along with bread and a mug of coffee, then stood at the counter with her arms crossed and watched. Clara ate. She did not apologize for her hunger or make commentary about the food or try to make conversation. She ate with the focused thoroughness of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, understood that dignity and desperation were not mutually exclusive. Where are you from originally? Martha asked, after a while. Iowa. My parents farmed outside of Rapids. Parents are gone? Both. Clara broke another piece of bread. Father 18 months ago. Mother 5 years before that. Siblings, 1 brother. He went west before my mother passed. We lost touch. Martha was quiet for a moment. Mr. Dawson told you his situation, I take it. Clara looked up. He told me his situation. And I'm thinking about it. Martha made a sound that might have been skepticism. Might have been something else. You're not what I expected, she said. Finally, what did you expect? Something weaker, Martha said, with characteristic bluntness. Most women who arrive here in your condition are either crying or lying. You're doing neither. Crying doesn't help, and lying makes things worse, Clara said. I find it's better to just deal with things as they are. Martha looked at her for another long moment. Then she picked up the coffee pot and refilled Clara's mug without being asked. It was not, Clara understood, a warm gesture, but it was a gesture. It meant something. He's a fair man, Martha said. Difficult sometimes. Keeps to himself, works too hard. Hasn't been the same since his wife passed. She paused. But he's fair. I'll give him that. How long ago did he lose her? 6 years. Fever. Quick. Martha set the coffee pot down. He doesn't talk about her. Don't ask him about her. I wasn't planning to. Most women who come through here try to fix him, Martha said. Or pity him. He doesn't need either. I'm not here to fix anyone, Clara said. I'm barely managing my own situation. Martha studied her. That's the most honest thing I've heard from a woman in this kitchen in quite some time. Clara slept that night in a clean, narrow room off the kitchen that smelled of cedar and old wool, and she lay awake for a long time with her hands folded on the blanket over her, looking at the ceiling and doing the kind of arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. She had arrived with one clear objective: find work, earn money, build enough stability to eventually find her way somewhere safe and sustainable. She had not arrived looking for a husband. She had not arrived looking for anything complicated. But the situation Caleb Dawson had described was not when she forced herself to look at it honestly, unreasonable. It was strange. It was abrupt. It was nothing like anything she would have chosen under different circumstances. It was also, practically speaking, the most secure offer anyone had made her in a year and a half. She thought about her cousin's hands on her arm in the hallway. She thought about her uncle's face when he told her to leave. She thought about 3 days on the road in broken boots, and the way people's eyes slid past her when she asked for help, seeing someone they didn't want to be responsible for. She thought about the way Caleb Dawson had looked at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. She thought about the phrase he'd used, "A wife who has no money of her own." Most men wouldn't have thought to say that. Most men wouldn't have thought it at all. She was still thinking when she finally fell asleep. And she woke up with something that felt, cautiously, like a decision beginning to take shape at the edges. She found Caleb Dawson at the breakfast table alone, which surprised her. She'd assumed a ranch this size had a formal dining arrangement. The owner at one end and the hands somewhere else entirely. Instead, he was sitting at a large wooden table with a cup of coffee and a set of papers. And he looked up when she came in, without any particular surprise, as if he'd been expecting her. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. Martha fed you?" "Martha fed me." And interrogated me. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "That sounds about right." Clara pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She folded her hands on the table. "I have some questions," she said. "All right. If I agree to this arrangement, what are the terms?" "Exactly. Not the general description, the specific terms. What am I responsible for? What authority do I have? What happens if we discover in 6 months that this doesn't work?" He set his papers down. He gave her his full attention, which she noticed because most men didn't. "The household is yours to run as you see fit. I'll tell you what we've been doing, and you can keep it. Change it or throw it out entirely based on your judgment. The domestic accounts go through you. I'll want monthly reports. Same as I do with the ranch accounts, not because I don't trust you, but because I run things that way across the board. Your wage is $60 a month." Clara blinked. "That's more than most ranch foremen make." "It's a demanding job," he said simply. "What happens if it doesn't work? You keep the wage you've earned. I'll provide you with a proper reference and a horse and enough money to get wherever you need to go." He paused. "I'm not in the business of trapping people, Miss Clara. If this arrangement fails, we handle it with dignity and go our separate ways." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why structure it this way? You could simply hire a housekeeper and a domestic manager and pay them separately and save yourself the complication of a legal arrangement." He was quiet for a moment, and for the first time she saw something move behind his expression that wasn't the calm practicality he'd shown her so far. It was brief and he put it away quickly, but she saw it. "Because a woman hired to keep house has no standing here," he said. "She can be dismissed on a bad day. She can be made uncomfortable by the men in ways I might not catch. She has no authority that anyone is required to respect." He looked at her steadily. "I want someone who has standing, who has authority, who people on this ranch know they have to answer to and treat with respect. The only way to make that real out here is to make it legal." It was the most words he'd strung together at once. She could hear that they cost him something to say. "You've thought about this for a while," she said. "Long enough." Clara took a breath. She looked at the table for a moment. Then back at him. "I have one condition." "Name it." "If at any point in the first year either of us decides this is a mistake, we handle it quietly and without drama, and neither of us speaks badly of the other afterward, regardless of what went wrong." "Done," he said. "All right," Clara said. And then, because she was someone who believed in clarity, "Then yes, Mr. Dawson. I accept your terms." He nodded. Like they'd just agreed on the price of grain, and somehow that made Clara trust him more than any number of romantic declarations could have. They were married 3 days later by the county justice of the peace, with Eddie Pruitt and Martha Collins as witnesses. In the front room of the ranch house with no flowers and no ceremony. In their ordinary clothes, with Clara still breaking in a pair of boots she'd borrowed from Martha, because her own were too far gone. The justice of the peace read the words. Clara said yes. Caleb said yes. They signed the papers. When it was done, Martha hugged Clara briefly, fiercely and unexpectedly, and then pulled back and looked at her like she dared Clara to mention it. Eddie shook both their hands with enormous enthusiasm, as if a great personal victory had been secured. Caleb looked at her. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. She was not in love with this man. She was not pretending to be. She was standing in a room where the papers said she was his wife, and he was her husband, and that was an extraordinary thing to have happened in 4 days. But extraordinary was not the same as wrong. She had standing now. She had authority. She had $60 a month and a home that was hers by legal right, and a man who had looked her in the eyes and told her what he needed and asked if she could provide it, rather than assuming she had no say in the matter. That was more than most women got. That was, Clara thought, something worth building on. The first week taught her the shape of the ranch, the way only living inside something can teach you. She learned that the kitchen had been running on barely controlled chaos under Martha's competent but overwhelmed management. Martha was a fine cook, but she was also doing the work of 3 people, managing the household linen, the supplies, the garden, the laundry schedule, and the cooking for 20 men who worked hard and needed to be fed well 3 times a day. She was doing it all, and doing it without complaint, and she was running herself ragged. Clara sat down with Martha on the second day and said, "I need to understand what you've been carrying." Martha looked at her with the cautious expression of someone who'd been told help was coming before and learned not to trust it. "It's manageable," she said, which Clara recognized as what people say when they're too proud to admit they're drowning. "I'm sure it is," Clara said. "I'm also sure it shouldn't be one person's job. Tell me what you're doing and we'll figure out what can be reorganized." It took Martha an hour to explain everything she was doing. By the end of it, she looked slightly surprised at the length of her own list, as if she'd grown so accustomed to the weight that she'd stopped noticing how heavy it was. "Right," Clara said. "Here's what we're going to change." She restructured the kitchen schedule so that the heaviest cooking prep was split across 2 days instead of piling everything before breakfast. She went through the supply records and found 3 areas where they were overpaying local merchants, and drafted letters to renegotiate those agreements. She found that the linen situation was a disaster of competing systems and established a single clear rotation. By the end of the first week, Martha was looking at her with an expression that was not quite warmth, but was moving steadily in that direction. The ranch hands were a different matter. 20 men had learned to be comfortable in a household that had no strong domestic authority, and some of them did not immediately welcome one. Not violently, not dramatically, but in the small testing ways that men sometimes behave when they want to establish whether a new authority is real or can be pushed. Jake Sutter was the one who pushed first. He was the head cook's assistant. 32, with the easy confidence of a man who'd been told he was charming often enough to believe it absolutely. He came into the kitchen one morning while Clara was reviewing the supply ledger and made a joke about the previous supply agreement that was designed to be funny at her expense. The room went quiet. Clara looked up from the ledger. She looked at Jake Sutter with the calm, measured expression of a woman who had faced down considerably worse than this and won. Then she said very pleasantly, "Mr. Sutter, those supply contracts are my responsibility now. Which means any concerns about them come through me directly, not as jokes to the room. If you have a genuine concern, I'm available after supper." She went back to the ledger. "That will be all, thank you." Jake Sutter left the kitchen. He did not make that particular kind of joke again. The other men who'd been in the room didn't say anything, but they heard it. Caleb heard about it from Eddie by the end of the day. He didn't say anything to Clara about it directly, but the next morning he made a point of including her in the daily report meeting with his foreman, introducing her as the person responsible for domestic operations and accounts, and making clear without saying it in so many words that she had his full authority behind her. Clara noted this. She didn't mention it to him, but she noted it. She found her way into the rhythm of the ranch the way water finds its way into stone slowly, persistently, taking the shape of what was already there, while gently, over time, changing it. The meals became something the men looked forward to instead of simply consuming. Clara had her mother's gift for food that felt like more than food that could take a man tired from 12 hours of work and give him back something he hadn't realized he was missing. The bread she made was different from Martha's, and Martha's had been good. But Clara's had this particular quality of warmth to it that Martha herself admitted eventually was something else entirely. "Where did you learn that?" Martha asked one morning. "Watching Clara shape the loaves." "My mother," Clara said. She said bread is about patience, about understanding that you can't rush it. The dough knows when you're not paying attention. Martha made a sound. "That sounds like something my grandmother would have said." "Maybe all grandmothers know the same things," Clara said. Martha almost smiled. "The thing about feeding people, really feeding them, with care and intention, is that it changes how they see you." The ranch hands began treating Clara differently, without quite knowing why. The meals gave them back something. Not just fuel. Memory. The feeling of being somewhere that someone cared whether they were comfortable. She overheard two of the older hands talking one evening outside the dining room. One of them said, "It's different since she came." The other one said, "Yeah, it's like somebody turned a light on." Clara stood in the hallway for a moment with that sentence, then went back to the kitchen and didn't say anything to anyone. Caleb Dawson was the most consistent thing on the ranch and the hardest to read. He was present. That was the first thing she learned about him. He didn't disappear into the house while the men worked. He was in it from first light until the day was done, doing the work alongside them, not performing it, not supervising it from a distance, actually doing it side by side, which was part of why his men worked the way they did, with the particular kind of investment that comes from being led by someone who doesn't ask more of others than they're willing to do themselves. He ate dinner at the table with whoever was there, asked real questions about what had gone well that day and what hadn't, listened to the answers without interrupting. He was, Clara thought, one of the most quietly decent people she had ever encountered. He was also extremely careful. He kept his distance from her in a way that was respectful but also deliberate. He didn't intrude on her space. He didn't ask personal questions. He gave her room and authority and stayed out of her way, which was everything he had promised and exactly what she had asked for. But there were moments, at dinner, when she would look up and find him watching her, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not inappropriate. Nothing like that. Just watching. With an intensity that he would put away immediately. Carefully, like a man storing something fragile in a box. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. They were two people honoring a practical arrangement. And they were both good at keeping their word. That was what they were. For now, that was enough. But one evening, 3 weeks in, Clara was going through the household accounts at the kitchen table, long after everyone else had gone to bed, and she heard footsteps in the hall, and then Caleb appeared in the doorway, with a cup of coffee in each hand. He held one out to her, without a word. She took it. He sat down across the table, not intrusively, just present. He looked at the papers in front of her. "Find anything?" "3 invoices that don't match the delivery records," she said. "Either someone made a consistent clerical error or someone's been skimming." He was very still for a moment. "How much? Over the last 8 months?" "Approximately $42. He was quiet. "Then who?" "I don't know yet. I want to be sure before I say a name." He looked at her. "How long until you're sure?" Give me 3 more days. He nodded. Drank his coffee. Didn't push, didn't take over. Didn't suggest that she hand it to someone else to handle. Thank you, he said after a while. Clara looked up. For what? For actually looking, he said. The accounts have been reviewed every month for years. Nobody found this. They were looking for obvious errors, Clara said. This person was careful. They moved small amounts in ways that looked like rounding mistakes. She paused. They're not stupid, just dishonest. Rare combination, he said. Unfortunately common, she said. He almost smiled at that. The corner of his mouth moved. She caught it and looked back down at her papers before anything showed on her face. Go to bed, he said, standing. The accounts will still be there in the morning. 10 more minutes, she said. That's what you said an hour ago, according to Martha. Clara looked up. Martha is tracking my hours. Martha worries, he said. It's her primary activity. He picked up both coffee cups and took them to the counter. 10 minutes. Then sleep, he left. Clara sat there for a moment in the quiet kitchen, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. Then she looked back at the accounts and found herself very slightly smiling. She did not go to bed in 10 minutes, but she went in 20, which was for her practically early. On the 25th day of her time at the Dawson Ranch, 2 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Clara found the proof she needed about the invoices. The responsible party was Ned Greer, one of the men who handled supply runs into town, who had been running a small, careful, 8-month scheme of slightly overbilling on receipts and pocketing the difference. It was not a large sum in the context of the ranch's operations. It was enough to matter to a man like Ned Greer, who was the kind of person who had convinced himself that taking small amounts from someone who wouldn't notice wasn't really stealing. Clara brought the evidence to Caleb that afternoon. Organized, annotated, and clear, she laid it out without drama, walked him through it methodically, and then waited. He looked at it for a long time. How do you want to handle it? He asked. She was surprised he asked. It's your ranch, she said. You found it, he said. It's your call too. Clara thought about it. Ned Greer has been here 4 years. He's a decent worker who made a bad choice and made it repeatedly. Which means it wasn't a moment of weakness, it was a decision he kept making. He needs to go. But I don't think we need to involve the sheriff if he pays it back and leaves quietly. That's my opinion, yours may differ. Caleb nodded slowly. That's how I'd have called it, he said. He handled Ned Greer that evening. Quietly, without drama. Ned left the next morning. The second thing that happened was a letter. It arrived in the afternoon post and was addressed to Clara Whitfield at the Dawson Ranch. Not Clara Dawson, which meant whoever sent it had known her address before the marriage, or had found it recently without knowing about it. The name on the return address was Harold Vane. Clara stood in the hall and looked at that name for a long time, and something cold moved through her chest. Harold Vane was the man her uncle had sold her debt to. The man her uncle had borrowed money from on her behalf allegedly and used her as collateral in a way that had no legal standing whatsoever, but that Harold Vane had somehow convinced himself was binding. He had told her before she fled that she owed him money, that she was obligated to him, that a debt like that didn't simply disappear because she'd chosen to walk away. She had not told Caleb about Harold Vane. She had not told anyone about Harold Vane. She stood in the hall and looked at that name, and she thought, this is what I didn't say. This is the thing I left out of the account I gave him. She opened the letter. It said, I know where you are now. And a marriage license doesn't change what you owe. I'll be in Montana by the end of the month. Clara folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket. She went back to the kitchen. She helped Martha with supper. She sat at the dinner table and listened to the men talk about the cattle count and the fence situation in the south pasture. She answered when Caleb asked her how the supply renegotiation letters had gone. She said nothing about the letter, but that night, lying in the dark with her hands folded on the blanket over her, She stared at the ceiling and felt the careful, practical, steady thing she had been building here begin to tremble at its edges. Harold Vane was coming, and she had not told Caleb Dawson the one thing he had a right to know before he made the arrangement he'd made with her. She had told him the truth about her uncle. She had told him about being put out of the house, about the accusations made against her character, about arriving with nothing. She had not told him about the man who believed she owed him something. Because she had let herself believe that she'd gotten far enough away that it wouldn't matter. She had been wrong. She lay there in the dark and thought about what it meant to have told the truth incompletely. And she thought about a man who had looked at her with direct, gray eyes and offered her standing and authority and the legal protection of his name, based on the account she had given him. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She thought about the end of the month, and she understood, with the cold clarity that comes when there's no more room for self-deception, that she was going to have to tell him all of it. The part she'd left out, the thing she'd hoped wouldn't follow her. She was going to have to tell him, and she had no idea what he was going to say. She told him the next morning. She had spent the night rehearsing how to say it, organizing the facts, finding the cleanest way through the explanation, and by the time the sun came up, she had decided that there was no clean way. There was only honest or dishonest, and she had already made her choice about which kind of person she was going to be in this arrangement. Caleb was at the barn before breakfast, as he always was. She found him there and said, "I need to tell you something. It's important, and I should have told you before we signed anything." He stopped what he was doing, turned to face her fully, said nothing, just waited, which she had come to understand was his way. He gave people room to say the thing they needed to say. Clara took a breath and said it plainly. "Before I came here, my uncle borrowed money from a man named Harold Vane. He borrowed it in my name without my knowledge or consent, which has no legal standing. When I refused to honor a debt I never incurred, Vane decided he had other means of collecting. He made it clear before I left that he considered me obligated to him in ways that had nothing to do with money." She kept her voice even. "I believed I had gotten far enough away that he wouldn't find me. I was wrong. He sent a letter yesterday. He knows where I am, and he's coming to Montana by the end of the month." The barn was very quiet. Caleb looked at her for a long time. His expression didn't change in the dramatic way she'd been bracing for. He didn't go red with anger or cold with betrayal. He just looked at her, steady and still, and she couldn't read what was moving behind his eyes. Finally he said, "Is there anything else you didn't tell me?" "No," she said. "That's everything, you're sure?" "I'm sure." He was quiet for another moment. "Then, what does he want?" "He wants me to go back," Clara said. "Or to pay a debt that isn't real." In his mind, those are the only two options. What's in his mind and what's legally true are different things, Caleb said. "Yes, they are. But Vane is the kind of man who makes real problems out of things that have no legal basis. He has money, and he has patience, and he has the particular confidence of someone who's never been told no by anyone with more power than him." She paused. "He won't just arrive and ask politely. He'll come with leverage, or with something that looks like leverage. He'll try to make your life difficult to make me compliant." Caleb absorbed this. His jaw moved slightly. Then he said, "You should have told me this before." "Yes," Clara said. "I should have. I'm sorry." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid it would cost me the arrangement before I'd had a chance to prove myself worth keeping." She met his eyes. "That was a mistake. I'm telling you now, because you deserve to make an informed decision about what you've gotten yourself into." The silence stretched. A horse shifted in the stall behind him. Somewhere outside, Eddie was calling to someone across the yard. "Are you giving me the chance to undo the arrangement?" Caleb asked. Clara looked at him. "If you want it undone, I won't fight it. You entered this in good faith on incomplete information. That's on me." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, then back at her. Then he said something she genuinely had not anticipated. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about Harold Vane. How he operates, what he's done before, how he typically applies pressure. I want to understand exactly what's coming before it gets here. He picked up what he'd set down when she came in. Come to the house after breakfast. Bring that letter. Clara stood there for a second. That's your response? He glanced at her. Did you expect a different one? Honestly? Yes. He's your problem, Caleb said, with a directness that was almost startling. Which makes him my problem. That's what the arrangement means. He moved toward the barn door. Breakfast first. Talk after. Clara followed him out of the barn, and she felt something shift in her chest that she didn't try to name yet. It wasn't relief exactly. It was bigger than relief. It was the strange, disorienting feeling of being stood beside when you'd fully expected to be left alone. She wasn't accustomed to it. She wasn't sure what to do with it. She decided to table that question and go have breakfast. Martha had made eggs and fresh biscuits and had apparently decided that this morning called for both, which suggested that Martha had noticed something in Clara's face and responded in her own particular language of care, which was food and practicality and no mention of feelings. Clara ate quickly. Caleb ate across the table without looking at her much. But he was present, which she had learned to read as its own form of message. Afterward, they sat at the table alone with the letter between them, and Clara told him everything she knew about Harold Vane. Vane was 51, originally from St. Louis, had made his money in land speculation and short-term lending at interest rates that were technically legal and practically predatory. He had a way of finding people in desperate circumstances and constructing arrangements that looked like help and functioned like traps. He was not violent, as far as Clara knew. He preferred legal maneuvering, real and invented, and the kind of social pressure that could destroy a reputation without leaving marks. He told my uncle he'd cancel the loan if the family provided him with what he called a domestic arrangement, Clara said carefully. My uncle agreed without telling me. By the time I understood what I'd been offered as collateral, the paperwork was already signed. She kept her voice flat and informational, because that was the only way she could say it without the anger getting so large it took over. When I refused, Vane told me I was in breach of a personal contract. He's been looking for me since March. Caleb's face was very still. Your uncle sold you, he said. Not a question. He needed the money more than he needed my opinion on the matter, Clara said. Something moved through Caleb's expression that was not calm, not controlled, not the steady, measured quality she'd come to expect from him. It was sharp and briefly visible and gone before she could fully read it. But it left a mark on the room. What kind of leverage will he bring? Caleb asked. He'll try to find something to use against you, Clara said. Something with your business, your reputation, or your standing in the county. If he can't find anything real, he'll fabricate something that sounds real enough to cause problems. And checks the details. She looked at him. I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because you need to know so you can prepare. What kind of preparation? Make sure your accounts are in perfect order. Every record, every transaction, every agreement documented and clean. He'll go after paperwork first, looking for anything that looks irregular. She paused. Your accounts are in good shape. I've been through them. But there may be older records I haven't seen yet. I'll have Thomas pull everything from the last 5 years, Caleb said. Thomas was his ranch foreman, a quiet, steady man of 40 who handled the operational records with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. Also, Clara said, he'll go after me socially. He'll tell a version of the story that makes me look like someone who fled an obligation. He'll probably claim the marriage was fraudulent in some way, or that I misrepresented myself to you. She held Caleb's gaze. Some people will believe him. He's very good at sounding credible. Some people believe anything that sounds like a scandal, Caleb said. That's not new information. It could damage your reputation. By association. My reputation is 30 years in the making, Caleb said. It can survive one man's story. Clara looked at him. He was so certain, not arrogant certain. There was a difference, and she understood it, and she found herself wanting to be as certain of things as he appeared to be. Because she had spent the last 18 months uncertain of nearly everything. "I'll start on the older records today," she said. "I'll handle Vane when he arrives," Caleb said. "We'll handle him," Clara said. And she heard the word "we" as she said it, and felt something about it settle in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. Caleb looked at her. A brief thing. Then he picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his own pocket. "Right," he said. "Let's get to work." The days between that conversation and the end of the month had a particular quality to them, a kind of double-layered existence where the surface was the ordinary rhythm of the ranch and the undercurrent was the constant low awareness that something was coming. Clara worked. She worked the way she always worked, which was completely, because partial effort had never felt like an option to her. She reorganized the older supply records, cross-referenced them against 5 years of delivery logs, and found 3 additional irregularities smaller than Ned Greer's scheme, but worth noting. She negotiated the renegotiated supply contracts and saved the ranch enough in annual costs that Caleb looked at the final numbers and said, "How?" And she said, "I read the original contracts, and they had been written by someone who didn't push back on anything," and he said, "Those contracts were written by me," and she said, "I know," and there was a moment where they both understood something about the value of different kinds of expertise. She also cooked. The cooking was the thing she hadn't expected to matter the way it did. She'd known it was a skill. She'd known it was useful. What she hadn't known was the particular way that feeding people well, consistently, and with care could change the atmosphere of a place. It started small, the bread. She'd been baking twice a week, as the previous household schedule dictated, but she shifted it to 3 times and added a 4th on Sunday because she'd noticed that the men were coming back for second portions, and there wasn't always enough. The bread disappeared faster than it arrived, which was the kind of problem that was easy to solve and significant to the people affected by its solution. Then she started varying the evening meals. The previous rotation had been functional solid, filling food that provided the calories a working man needed, but it had the repetitive predictability of a schedule rather than the warmth of cooking that came from actual thought about the people being fed. She started asking questions, not intrusively, just quietly, working in observations about what the men responded to, what they left on their plates, what made them linger at the table a little longer, instead of heading straight to the bunkhouse. Old Pete Callahan, who was 58 and had been on the ranch longer than anyone except Martha, had a particular expression when she made the bean and ham soup that his face didn't make at anything else. She noticed this. She started making it every 2 weeks. He never said anything, but he always finished his bowl first when that was the meal. And once she caught him sitting at the table after everyone else had left, just quiet, and she understood that the soup reminded him of something specific and important. And she didn't ask what. "You're doing something to those men," Martha said one afternoon, watching the empty bread basket with the slightly mystified expression of someone observing a phenomenon they can't quite explain. "I'm feeding them," Clara said. "I've been feeding them for 7 years," Martha said. "You've been keeping them alive," Clara said, which was not a criticism, because Martha knew she didn't mean it as one. "I'm trying to do something slightly different." Martha considered this. "The difference being, you feed the body," Clara said. "I'm also trying to feed the part that remembers being somewhere someone cared about them." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's either very wise or very sentimental." "It can be both," Clara said. Martha picked up the bread basket. "It can," she agreed. What Clara didn't say, because she was still working it out herself, was that she was doing the same thing for herself. Every meal she prepared with intention was a small act of insisting that she was someone worth listening to. Every renegotiated contract, every balanced ledger, Every problem she solved, before anyone had to ask her to, was a small refutation of every person who had told her she was a burden. She was building something here, not just for the ranch. For herself, she was reclaiming who she was one day at a time. In the only language she had always spoken fluently, work. Caleb noticed things she was becoming increasingly aware of. He didn't comment on them the way another person might, with praise or observation or the verbal acknowledgement that would have made it social. He noticed things and responded to them practically. Which she was beginning to understand was how he expressed most of what he felt. He restructured the morning meeting so that Clara's domestic report came first, which elevated its formal priority in the day's operations. He made sure she had the supplies she requested without ever making her justify the request. When one of the newer hands was visibly uncomfortable taking direction from a woman and made it mildly known, Caleb had a conversation with him that Clara wasn't privy to, and that the hand was very quiet about afterward. But the discomfort disappeared. He did these things without announcing them. She noticed them the same way he noticed hers, quietly, and with attention. One evening she asked him directly, because she had found that with him direct was always the better approach. "Why did you restructure the morning meeting?" He looked slightly surprised by the question. "Because the domestic report affects the work schedule, and it made more sense to hear it first." "That's true," Clara said. "It also happens to mean that the men hear me before they hear the ranch report. It changes how they frame my authority." A pause. He looked at her with those gray eyes. "Yes," he said. "It does." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He picked up his coffee. "The ranch runs better when people respect the people running it," he said. "That's just operations. You don't have to explain your good intentions to me," Clara said. "I'm not explaining intentions," he said. "I'm explaining logic." "You can do both," she said. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth gone before it fully arrived. She was starting to map the geography of his almost smiles the way you learn to navigate by half-visible landmarks. Eddie Pruitt, who missed nothing and said too much, caught Clara alone by the corral one afternoon and said, with his characteristic complete lack of subtlety, "You're good for him, you know, Mr. Dawson. He laughs more." "He doesn't laugh," Clara said. "He almost laughs," Eddie said, as if this were essentially the same thing. "He's never almost laughed this much, in the whole time I've been here." He considered this with great solemnity. "I think that's significant. I think you should go check the fence line," Clara said. Eddie said cheerfully and went. Clara stood there for a moment and told herself very firmly that she was not thinking about what Eddie had said, and then thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. It was on a Thursday evening, 16 days after Vane's letter arrived, that the second letter came. It was addressed to Caleb this time. Same handwriting, same return address. Clara recognized it the moment she saw it on the mail table and felt the cold move through her chest again. She didn't open it. It wasn't her letter to open. She brought it to Caleb at the barn, because that was where he was, and handed it to him and said, "It's from Vane." He looked at the return address, opened it, read it. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something he didn't immediately know how to respond to: a very slight stillness, a barely visible tightening around the jaw. He handed it to her. She read it. Harold Vane wrote that he was aware that Clara Whitfield had entered into a marriage under false pretenses, having concealed from her husband significant obligations of a personal and financial nature. He wrote that he was prepared to bring this information before the county judge and the local community unless Mr. Dawson was willing to discuss the matter of his wife's outstanding obligations in a reasonable and private manner. He named a time and place the following Tuesday, at the hotel in Millbrook, which was the nearest town of any size. He signed it with the elaborate signature of a man who had practiced looking important. "He's threatening you with social embarrassment," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "He is threatening to tell people you came here hiding something," Caleb said. "Which is technically true and also no one's business." He'll call the marriage fraudulent. He'll suggest I deceived you into it. You told me about him the morning after you got the letter, Caleb said. That's not deception. He doesn't know that. Then we tell the county judge that, Caleb said simply. Clara looked at him. You're going to meet with him. No, Caleb said. We're going to meet with him, Caleb. This is your situation, he said. Which means you should be in the room when it's resolved. Not waiting outside while someone else handles it for you. He folded the letter. I'm not going to Millbrook to represent you. I'm going as your husband. Which means we go together and we handle it together. He paused. Unless you'd prefer otherwise. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was trying to think of the last time someone had said we when they meant it, without it being a performance or a convenience. No, she said. Together is right. He nodded. The matter appeared settled in his mind. He went back to what he'd been doing in the barn. After a moment, Clara went back to the house. In the kitchen, Martha was at the stove with her back to the room. Without turning around, she said, That man's coming, isn't he? It wasn't a question. Yes, Clara said. When Tuesday, Martha stirred whatever was on the stove. Caleb knows we just read his letter together. Good. Martha didn't turn around. Some trouble you face better when you're not alone. Clara stood there for a moment. Martha, don't say anything sentimental, Martha said immediately. I was going to ask if you needed help with supper. Martha glanced at her over her shoulder. Something in her face softened slightly. You can cut the onions, she said. You never cry at onions. I never cry at anything if I can help it, Clara said. I know, Martha said. That's why I trust you with them. Clara got the cutting board and the knife and started cutting onions. And the kitchen was warm and quiet, and she was aware. In the kind of way you're aware of things you haven't let yourself name yet. That this was what she had been looking for when she walked through that gate. Not safety exactly, not security, though those things mattered. This specific feeling of being known by people who chose to know her, in a kitchen that smelled like supper, with the sound of the ranch running outside and the particular steadiness of a place that had made room for her. She cut the onions very precisely and did not cry at them. The hands found out about Vane. Somehow she suspected Eddie, who had a genius for absorbing information he wasn't supposed to have and an inability to contain it, and the response was quieter and more revealing than she expected. No one made a dramatic show of it, but things shifted. Old Pete found an excuse to be near the main house more than usual. Tom Briggs, who ran the stable and had always been politely neutral about Clara's presence, started greeting her in the morning with the particular warm directness of someone who had made a decision about where he stood. Jake Sutter, who had learned his lessons about jokes in the kitchen, went out of his way to nod to her at dinner with a respect that felt genuine rather than performed. These men had watched her for a month. They had eaten her food and seen how she worked and noticed that she didn't flinch at difficulty. Now trouble was coming from outside, and they were, in their quiet, unshowy way, arranging themselves around her. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did they. But she noticed. Monday evening, the night before the Millbrook meeting, Clara sat at the kitchen table long after everyone was asleep and allowed herself, for the first time, to be frightened. Not the surface fear that had been running under everything for weeks. The deeper kind, the kind she'd been keeping organized and managed and boxed away because there had always been too much to do to let it out. She was frightened that Vane would find some legal thread she hadn't anticipated. She was frightened that his social pressure would damage Caleb in ways that mattered in this county, in this community that she didn't fully understand yet because she was still new here. She was frightened that even if everything went right, the association with her history would shadow Caleb's good name in ways neither of them could see yet. And underneath that, the fear she would not say aloud to anyone, would barely say to herself she was frightened that Caleb would decide, at some point, that the arrangement was costing more than it was worth. that she would see the calculation change in his eyes, that the fair and decent man who had looked at her at the gate and offered her standing would eventually look at her and see only the complications she had brought with her. She sat there for a while with all of that. She didn't push it away. She let it be there, recognized it, and then carefully, deliberately set it aside. Being frightened was real. Letting fear make the decisions was optional. She heard footsteps. Caleb appeared in the doorway the way he had before, reading her hours apparently with the same accuracy as Martha. He was in his work clothes still, which meant he'd been in the barn, late. He looked at her sitting at the kitchen table with no papers in front of her, which she knew he noticed because he noticed everything. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He didn't offer reassurance. He just sat there, present and quiet, in the particular way he had of making a room feel steadier simply by being in it. After a while he said, "I've been to Millbrook before. The hotel where he's set the meeting is in the middle of the main street. Public building, public meeting room. He's chosen it because he thinks the location gives him social leverage being seen there. People knowing the meeting is happening." Clara looked at him. Or we arrive early before he does, and we're already there and settled when he comes in. His entrance becomes less effective. He paused. Small thing. But it matters. "We arrive early," Clara said. "We arrive early." She looked at this man sitting across from her in the late-night kitchen. This man who had in 30 days managed to see her more clearly than anyone had seen her in years. And she thought, "I don't know what to do with you. You are not what I prepared myself for." What she said was, "What time do we need to leave?" He said. "To be there by 9. I'll be ready at 6:30, she said. He almost smiled. "Why am I not surprised?" "Because you pay attention," she said. He looked at her across the table. Something was there in his expression that was not the professional steady quality she'd come to map. Something more unguarded briefly. The way a careful man looks when he's forgotten to be careful for just a second. Then he stood up, and the moment passed, and he was the steady ranch owner again. Practical and contained. 6:30, he confirmed. 6:30, she agreed. He said goodnight and left the kitchen. Clara sat for a moment in the quiet he left behind. She thought about arriving early, about small advantages that mattered, about a man who thought in strategies not because he was calculating, but because he had learned that the world rewarded people who prepared. She thought about Vane sitting in that hotel, confident in his leverage, expecting a frightened woman and a husband who wanted the problem to go away quietly. She thought about what it meant to walk into a room already settled, already together, already decided, and something shifted in her chest that felt less like fear and more like the absence of it. Not courage exactly, just the clean, solid determination of someone who has decided that they are done being moved by other people's confidence in her helplessness. Harold Vane was coming to Montana with leverage and a signature and a very certain idea about who Clara Whitfield was. He was about to discover that Clara Whitfield didn't exist anymore. The woman who would walk into that hotel was Clara Dawson. And Clara Dawson had never begged for anything in her life. She sat in the kitchen for another few minutes, then she went to bed. She slept soundly, without dreams, for the first time since the letter came. They left at 6:30 exactly. Clara was waiting at the front door when Caleb came down the hall. And he saw her standing there with her coat on and her hair done properly and a small leather satchel in her hand. And he said nothing, just nodded once and reached past her to open the door. And that was how they began the day that would determine whether everything she had built in the last month would survive contact with the man who had been hunting her since March. The ride to Millbrook took just under 2 hours. They sat side by side in the wagon and talked very little, which Clara had come to understand was not uncomfortable silence, but the particular quiet of two people who had run out of things to prepare and were simply waiting for the moment to arrive. She had the satchel on her lap. Inside it was every document she had assembled over the past 16 days, the original loan paperwork her uncle had signed, which she had obtained from the county clerk's office in Billings before she left and kept folded inside her dress the entire way to Montana, because she had known, even then, that she might need it. A written statement about the circumstances of her departure from her uncle's house. The letter Vane had sent to her. The letter he had sent to Caleb. And a carefully organized summary of Harold Vane's history of similar arrangements with other families, which she had pieced together from 3 separate sources, because she was someone who believed in knowing the full shape of a problem before she tried to solve it. Caleb glanced at the satchel once. "You've had that prepared for a while," he said. "Since the first letter," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You prepared before you told me." "I prepared the night the letter arrived," she said. "I told you the next morning." He nodded slowly. Not disapproval. Something more like recognition, the look of someone who would have done the same thing. "What's in it?" he asked. She told him all of it, including the part about the document she had carried, folded inside her dress across 3 days of road, because she'd known her uncle would deny everything, if it ever came to that. And she had needed the original in her own hands before anyone else could make it disappear. Caleb was quiet for a long time after she finished. "You've been fighting this man since before you left Billings," he said. "I've been fighting this situation my entire life," Clara said. "Vane is just the latest version of it." He looked at the road ahead. His jaw moved once. Then he said quietly, but with the kind of certainty that lives in the chest rather than the head, "He's not going to win." It was not a performance. He wasn't saying it to comfort her or to sound resolute. He said it the way you state something you have already verified. Clara held the satchel in her lap and said, "No, he's not." They arrived in Millbrook at 8:40. The hotel sat on the main street with its windows looking out over the road. And they went inside and asked for the meeting room. And the clerk told them Mr. Vane had booked it for 10 o'clock. Caleb told the clerk they were using it now, handed him a coin without drama. And the clerk showed them in. They were seated at the table with coffee when Harold Vane walked through the door at 9:58. He was not what Clara would have called an imposing man to look at. He was 60 years old, well-dressed, with the polished surface of someone who had spent decades making sure he appeared reasonable and trustworthy right up until the moment he wasn't. He had a lawyer with him, a soft-faced young man carrying a leather briefcase who looked like he had been hired more for the visual impression than any particular legal expertise. Vane stopped when he saw them, both of them. Already there. Already settled, coffee in hand. Clara, with the satchel open on the table, and papers arranged with the precision of someone who intended to be taken seriously. The calculation moved through his face. He had expected to walk into an empty room and be in control of the arrangement before they arrived. That expectation was now gone, and he had to restructure quickly. Which he did, because he was experienced. But Clara saw the adjustment, and she understood that the early arrival had already cost him something. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, and then to Caleb, "Mr. Dawson." "Vane," Caleb said. He did not stand. He gestured toward the chairs across the table with the ease of a man in his own kitchen. "Sit down." The power of that sentence, delivered in that tone. From a man sitting at ease in a room Vane had arranged for himself, was not lost on anyone present. The lawyer looked at Vane. Vane sat down. "I'll be direct," Vane said. "I've made that offer before, and it's always better for everyone." "Go ahead," Caleb said. Vane looked at Clara. "Your wife entered this marriage without disclosing a significant personal obligation. A debt incurred on her behalf by her family, which she has refused to honor. I have legal documentation of the original agreement." He opened his briefcase and produced papers. "I'm prepared to make these public before the county court and before the community, unless we can reach a private resolution today." "What resolution?" Caleb asked. "Mrs. Dawson returns with me to settle the matter personally," Vane said. "Alternatively, you pay the outstanding amount on her behalf." and we consider the matter closed." The room was quiet. Then Clara reached into her satchel, drew out her own papers, and placed them on the table with the particular calm of someone playing the last card in a hand they have known they held since before the game began. "The loan agreement you're holding," she said, "was signed by Gerald Whitfield, my uncle, using my name and without my knowledge or consent. I was not present at the signing. I did not authorize the use of my name. I did not receive any portion of the money." She pushed the first document across the table. "This is the original loan paperwork, which you'll notice does not contain my signature. Only my uncle's. This is a sworn statement from the clerk who processed the loan, confirming that only Gerald Whitfield was present at signing." She pushed the second document. "And this," she said, placing the third, "is a record of 4 other agreements Harold Vane has structured in substantially the same way across 3 counties arrangements, in which the signatures of absent family members, primarily female ones, were used to create obligations those individuals never incurred." Vane's face had gone very still. His lawyer was looking at the documents with an expression that had moved well past his professional training to contain. "Those records are not," Vane began. "They are obtained from county court filings," Clara said. "They're public documents. Any judge will verify them." She looked at him across the table with the steady, unafraid gaze of a woman who had spent 3 days on a broken road and 16 days in preparation specifically for this moment. "You have built a business on finding desperate people and constructing obligations they never agreed to. You found my uncle, who was desperate and not particularly scrupulous, and you found me, who you believed was sufficiently alone and frightened that I would cooperate to make the problem stop." She paused. "I am not frightened of you, Mr. Vane. I have never been frightened of you. I have been managing you, which is a different thing." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely. Caleb sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't need to. He was there, present, and entirely, calmly on her side, which was the only thing he needed to be. "You have no legal claim," Clara continued, "because the debt was never mine. You have no social leverage, because I have already told my husband the complete truth of my history, which means there is nothing you know that he doesn't." She kept her voice level. "What you do have is the choice to leave Montana today without incident, or to pursue this through the county court, where these documents will become part of public record and where I will be requesting an investigation into your business practices across all 3 counties." She tilted her head slightly. "I'd think about that second option carefully before you chose it." Vane looked at her for a long time. He had the look of a man reassessing something from the foundation up. Not with admiration, but with the cold recognition of someone who had badly misjudged their opponent. He looked at Caleb. "Your wife is very capable," Caleb said, without missing a beat. "Yes, I'm aware." Vane stood up. His lawyer stood up. They looked at each other briefly, with the shared expression of people who have just understood that the room they walked into was not the room they had prepared for. "We'll be going," Vane said. "Safe travels," Caleb said. They left. The door closed. The room was quiet. Clara sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, looking at the door, feeling the tension leave her body in one long, slow exhale that she allowed herself, because no one was watching her now except Caleb. And she had stopped pretending to be made of stone in front of Caleb sometime in the last week without entirely realizing it. "That's done," she said. "That's done," he agreed. She began gathering the papers back into the shell. Her hands were steady. She was faintly proud of that. "He might try again," she said. "People like him sometimes do. If he tries again, he'll get the same answer," Caleb said. Clara closed the satchel. She looked across the table at her husband, this man who had sat beside her through the whole of it, and not once tried to take it from her, or manage it for her, or make it smaller than it was, so she would feel less frightened. He had simply been there on her side while she handled it herself. "Thank you," she said, "for not intervening." He looked at her. "You didn't need me to intervene." I know, she said. That's why it mattered that you didn't. Something in his expression shifted. It was the most open she had seen his face since the morning she told him about Vane, not the controlled directness of a man managing a practical situation, but something underneath that, something that hadn't found a name yet. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the room was very quiet, and outside through the hotel window, Millbrook was going about its morning, as if nothing had just changed. Then Caleb picked up his hat. Are you hungry? I'm extremely hungry, Clara said. There's a place on the next street that does good eggs, he said. Let's go, she said. They ate breakfast in a busy dining room, with other people's conversations washing around them. And they talked about the ranch, the fence situation in the south pasture, the supply delivery expected Thursday, whether old Pete's assessment of the northern grazing land was correct. And it was the most ordinary conversation imaginable. And Clara understood that this was also how he handled things. By returning to the concrete, the manageable, the real. It was not avoidance. It was the particular intelligence of a man who knew that the way to stomp something shaken was to press it back against firm ground. She found herself doing the same thing, and was obscurely comforted by that. They were back at the ranch by midday. Martha looked at them when they came through the door. Read everything she needed from Clara's face in approximately 2 seconds, and turned back to the stove without saying a single word, which was its own entire statement. Eddie Pruitt lasted about 4 minutes before appearing in the kitchen doorway with an expression of barely contained inquiry. Caleb looked at him once. Eddie disappeared. It was later, mid-afternoon, when the storm arrived. It came in fast, the way Montana summer storms did, not gradually building on the horizon, but appearing almost fully formed. The sky going dark, and the wind picking up with a speed that gave maybe 20 minutes of warning before it was entirely serious. Clara was in the kitchen going over the Thursday supply list when she heard the shift in the wind, and then the first crack of thunder. And she looked up and understood immediately, from the way the ranch hands were moving outside, that this was not an ordinary afternoon rain. She went to the door. Caleb was already crossing the yard toward the barn, with Thomas beside him. Their strides quick and purposeful. She heard the word cattle, and she heard south pasture, and she heard fence. And she understood the southern fence had been a concern for weeks. And if it went in a storm of this size, 200 head of cattle in the adjacent pasture would scatter across open land in dangerous conditions. And rounding them up in a storm with poor visibility was exactly the kind of situation that turned into a crisis if it wasn't met immediately. She went back inside. She changed her shoes for her boots, the proper ones, the ones that worked. She went to the barn. Caleb was organizing the hands with the focused efficiency of someone running a problem he had run before. He looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted. Clara, I can ride, she said. You know I can. It's going to be bad out there. The fence is down in the south pasture, she said. You need every rider you have. I need you safe. I need to help, she said. And then, because they had established early on, that direct was always the better approach. Don't manage me, Caleb. Not now, not with this. He looked at her for one long moment. She watched him run the calculation, her safety against the need, the risk against the reality of who she was, and she watched him land on the honest answer. Stay with Eddie, he said. Don't go past the creek on the east side. Understood, she said. He nodded once, and went back to organizing. Clara saddled her horse she had been riding since she was 7. Her father's doing, and she had been going out with the ranch hands on quieter mornings for the past 2 weeks. Building her read of the land, and went out into the rising storm with the rest of them. What happened over the next 3 hours was the hardest physical work Clara had done since arriving at the ranch, and she had not been idle. The storm hit full force within 30 minutes of their leaving the barn, and riding in it was nothing like the pleasant morning exercises she'd been doing. The wind was serious, and the visibility was genuinely poor, and the cattle were frightened and unhelpful in the way that frightened cattle are. moving unpredictably and loudly and requiring constant, active management to get moving in the right direction. She stayed with Eddie as promised, and Eddie turned out to be a significantly better horseman than his 19 years, and easy manner suggested, reading the cattle and the terrain with an instinct that was clearly long practice rather than natural gift. He called instructions to her over the wind, and she followed them, and they worked the east flank together with a coordination that developed quickly because they were both paying attention to the same things. She was aware of Caleb throughout, not watching him constantly, but knowing where he was the way you know where the steadiest thing in a room is, peripherally, without having to look directly. He was everywhere. The problem was worst. He moved through the chaos with the particular authority of someone who had done this before and understood what it required. And the men around him moved differently because he was there, with more confidence and less panic. Then she heard it. Not the storm, a different sound, coming from the east, near the creek she had been told not to cross. She pulled her horse up and listened. It was cattle, a group of them further than they should have been, past the creek and into the rough ground beyond it, which in this visibility and with the creek running high from the rain was genuinely dangerous ground for both animals and riders. She looked at Eddie. He had heard it too. "That's past your boundary," he said. She looked toward the sound, counted in her head the number of cattle unaccounted for, the direction of the sound, the probable distance, what it would mean if they stayed out there in this weather, on rough ground, near a swollen creek through the night. "Eddie," she said, "go get Caleb. Tell him the East Creek group is past the boundary and moving further. Go now." "What do you go?" she said, and she went. She crossed the creek at the shallowest point, which was not shallow, and the cold water hit her boots and her legs, and her horse objected, and she talked to the horse the way her father had taught her, low and steady, and they made it across, and she pushed forward toward the sound. She found them, 11 cattle, bunched together and agitated near a drop in the ground that, in better conditions, would have been a minor dip, but in this rain had become something that could genuinely hurt them if they moved wrong. She put herself between the group and the drop and started working them back, the way she had watched the ranch hands work all morning, using her horse's position and her own noise to encourage them in the direction she needed them to go. It was harder alone, much harder. With one rider and 11 frightened animals and a creek to cross going back, it was the kind of problem that wanted more hands. But she had gotten here, and she was not leaving without them. So she worked. She talked to the cattle the way she talked to the bread dough, low and patient and consistent, and she used her horse and her positioning, and she moved them slowly back toward the creek. She was almost there. The creek was 15 yards ahead. The cattle in a manageable group, her arms burning from the sustained effort when her horse slipped. It was a small slip. The ground was soft with rain, and her horse caught it quickly. But the lurch was enough to throw her balance, and she grabbed the saddle horn and stayed on, but her shoulder hit something at an angle that sent a sharp, serious pain down her arm. She kept moving. The pain was there, and she noted it, and she kept moving because the cattle were almost at the crossing, and stopping now was not an option. She got them across. She was in the middle of the creek, the water higher than when she'd come through the first time, her shoulder screaming, and her horse breathing hard. When she heard hooves and looked up, and Caleb was there on the opposite bank with 2 of the hands. And the expression on his face when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, something that was not calm, and was not managed, and was not the controlled directness of a practical man. It was fear, and behind the fear something else. He pushed his horse into the creek and was beside her in seconds. "Are you hurt?" "My shoulder. I slipped. It's manageable." "Clara, the cattle are across," she said. 11 head. "Help me get them to the others." He looked at her for one moment with that unguarded expression. Then he turned to the hands behind him, and they moved to take the cattle. And Caleb stayed beside her all the way back, not touching her, not fussing, just present, his horse close to hers, which she understood was both worry and respect in the language he spoke. When they got back to the barn and she dismounted, he caught her arm, the good one, as she came down, and didn't let go until she was steady on the ground. "Let me look at that shoulder," he said. "It's not broken," she said. "I've had broken bones before. This isn't that. Let me look at it anyway," he said. And something in his voice made it not a request, exactly. And she let him because her shoulder hurt and she was cold and wet and extraordinarily tired. And because she had also passed the point of needing to prove she didn't need anything from anyone in this place. He checked her shoulder with the careful competence of a man who had dealt with injuries on a working ranch for years. He found the spot that was worst, pressed it gently. Watched her face when he did. "Bruised," he said. "Badly." "But not broken." "That's what I said," she said. "Yes," he said, without releasing her arm. He was standing very close to her. The barn was loud with the aftermath of the gathered cattle and the voices of the men and the diminishing storm outside. And in the middle of all of it, he was standing there, holding her arm very carefully and looking at her with an expression that had not returned to its usual careful management. "You crossed the creek," he said. "The cattle were past it. I told you not to. You also told me not to leave them out there," she said. "You just didn't use those words." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have been seriously hurt. I knew what I was doing," she said. "And I made the right call. You know that." He did know it. She could see him knowing it. She could also see that knowing it didn't eliminate the thing that had been in his face when he found her in the creek, the fear that had been there before he could manage it away. "Caleb." He looked at her. "I'm all right," she said. Quietly and directly, the way she said everything to him. "I'm right here." Something moved through his face. He took a breath. He released her arm slowly, carefully. "Like setting something valuable down." "I know," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "I can see that." He stood there for another moment. Then he called to Thomas about the cattle count, and the moment shifted back to the practical, and he moved away to deal with the aftermath of the storm. And Clara stood in the barn doorway with her hurt shoulder and her soaking boots and watched him go. Martha appeared at her elbow with a blanket and the expression of someone maintaining iron control over several strong feelings. She put the blanket around Clara's shoulders without ceremony. "You crossed the creek," Martha said. 11 head of cattle were past it. "I know. Eddie told us." Martha pulled the blanket tighter. "You're soaked through, I noticed," Clara said. Martha stopped. She looked across the barn at Caleb, who was talking to Thomas with the focused energy of a man throwing himself back into the operational. "He was not calm," she said carefully, "when Eddie told him you'd gone over." Clara looked at Caleb. "He rode out himself," Martha said. "Didn't send the hands first." "Went himself." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Martha," she said. "Don't," Martha said. "I was just going to say thank you." "For the blanket," Martha made her sound. "Come inside before you get sick," she said. "I'll heat water for a bath, and there's soup on the stove, and you can worry about whatever you're not saying to me after you're warm." Clara went inside. She had the bath and the soup, and her shoulder was wrapped, and she put on dry clothes and sat at the kitchen table, while Martha moved around with the steady efficiency of someone who cared through doing rather than saying. The storm had passed. The cattle were in. The ranch was settling back into its evening rhythm. Old Pete came to the kitchen door, something he had never done before, and knocked once, and said, through the door, without coming in, "Mrs. Dawson, all accounted for. Good riding." Then his footsteps retreated before she could respond. Clara sat at the table and looked at her hands. Her shoulder ached. She was tired in a complete, thorough way that felt, strangely, like satisfaction. This was what she had told Caleb in the barn. She no longer saw the ranch as a temporary shelter. She had known it intellectually for some time now. But it was one thing to know something, and another to have it proven by the fact of your own behavior, by the evidence of what you're willing to cross a swollen creek for. This was her home. These were her people. The cattle were her cattle. And the land was her land. And the man who had looked at her in a swollen creek with everything he usually kept managed suddenly, showing completely on his face. He was her husband. Not in name and paperwork only. She didn't know yet what that meant in full. She didn't know what he felt or what she felt or where the careful, practical arrangement they had made was actually heading. There was too much still unknown, too much still developing. But she knew what the day had proven about herself. Harold Vane in the morning, and a Montana storm in the afternoon. And she was still here, dry and warm and sore and entirely, completely here. The door opened, came in. He stopped when he saw her at the table. Looked at her with an expression that was different from every other expression she had catalogued from him. And she was still trying to read it when he sat down across from her, the way he always did, and Martha put coffee in front of both of them without being asked. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He didn't speak immediately, which was normal, but there was something different in the quality of this silence. It wasn't the quiet of two people being practical together. It was something that had weight and color and was waiting for something. Finally, he said, "When Eddie told me you'd crossed the creek," he stopped. He looked at the coffee mug. He looked back at her. "I wasn't calm," he said. Clara looked at him. She thought about what Martha had said. About him going himself. About the face she had seen from the opposite bank. "I know," she said quietly. "I need you to understand," he said. Slowly, like a man picking his way across this uncertain ground, that my investment in this arrangement has changed. From what I described at the gate, he looked at her steadily. "I'm not sure exactly when it changed, but I'm telling you because you deserve to know, and because honesty was the basis of this, and I'm not going to stop now." Clara held his gaze. "I don't know what you feel," he said, "and I'm not asking. You don't owe me anything beyond what we agreed, but I wanted to be honest." He paused. "I've been that with you from the beginning. I'm not stopping now." The kitchen was warm. The soup was on the stove. Outside the ranch was quiet after the storm. Clara looked at this man, this careful, honest, decent man who had given her standing when she had nothing and stood beside her when it cost him something, and ridden into a swollen creek because he was, it turned out, considerably more than the fair and practical rancher he had originally presented himself to be. She thought about the word honest, about how rare it was, about how it was the thing she had trusted first about him and kept trusting, because he kept earning it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just once, briefly, the way you press a seal on something you mean. "I know," she said, "and I'm glad you told me." He looked at her hand on his. Then at her. Something in his face settled, like a thing finally put down after being carried too long. Martha, at the stove, stirred something very industriously and said absolutely nothing, which was the loudest statement she had made all day. Part 4 Louis, Vit 4000, 204,000, 500, the Lin Kate Lin Mike, Vikak Fun Chuk Chum Ko Chuent. Fa Hoi Twai, Dao Tang Mot Ko Chuent Lin Mike, He Gep Lai. Moi Fun Lin Mike, Voi Fun Chuk, Kom Zoi Tio Lai Ko Chuent, Ado Fun Moi. Lin Kate Kak Fun Kwa Ko Chuent Mot Kak Lin Mike. Su Zung Ko Chuent Tip Zo Kak Fun. Dui Chi Chu Day. Trang Nut Quang Dot Ngot. Kom Suzung Magak Do Zong Huak Dio De Fu. Fong Kaik K Chuent Mi Hua Ki Zong Van Zo Kam Suk. Chen Tuk Va Gun Gui. Kom Mota Kaing, Tập Trung Vào Hành Động Cảm Xúc Và Tâm Lý Nhân Vật. Vit Fun 2 Dat Diem 1010, Và Bo Tusung Tiet To Ko Chuyen. K Theo Ngoi Tu Ba. Tăng Do Kik Ding Kung Vit Lon Man. Kết Tuk Fun Kom Zoi Tio Fun Sao. Lưu Y Chaloi Trong Muk Din Yan Kom Nye Sang Muk Document. Moi 2-3 Foot Kun Ka Mini Climax, Và Dat 10-15 Mini Climax Moi Fun. Ku 10-12 Foot Ka 1 Twist Lun So Suck. Don Zen Mini Cliffhanger Might Hun. Tung Thing Tự Nhiên Cho Phản ứng của các nhân vật. Tim Nhịp Điệu Kịch Ting. Thực tế và gần gũi, mỗi 18 phút cần có mọc dù chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng link cho tôi. Viết liền Mike, Kumkazogakngangan Kaikaktrang Part 4. A Marriage Built on Respect, the morning after the storm. Clara woke before anyone else. Her shoulder ached with the particular deep insistence of a bruise that had had all night to settle into its full extent. And she lay still for a moment, taking inventory. Shoulder, ribs where she'd grabbed the saddle, her legs which had been wet and cold for 3 hours and were making their opinion known. Nothing broken, everything operational. She got up. She was in the kitchen before Martha, which had never happened before. And she had coffee made, and the bread started by the time Martha appeared in the doorway and stopped dead at the sight of her. "You should be resting," Martha said. "The bread doesn't know that," Clara said. Martha looked at her for a moment, with the expression she used when she disagreed with something, but recognized that arguing would be pointless. She came into the kitchen and tied on her apron, and they worked side by side in the early morning quiet. And Martha didn't say anything about the previous evening, or about Caleb, or about the hand on the coffee mug, because Martha understood that some things were better honored by silence than by commentary. What Martha did do was make sure Clara's coffee was always full and never mentioned the way she occasionally shifted to favor the good shoulder, which was its own entire statement in Martha's language. Caleb came down an hour later and stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way Martha had, looking at Clara at the counter with the bread. Something moved through his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man confirming something he had suspected. "You're supposed to rest that shoulder," he said. "Good morning to you too," Clara said. He came into the kitchen and poured his own coffee, which he never did. Martha always had it ready and stood at the counter near where she was working. Not in her way, just near. "How manageable," she said. "Clara." She looked at him. He was looking back with the particular directness he used when he wanted a real answer rather than the organized version. "It's genuinely manageable," she said, sore, not debilitating. "I've had worse from farm work and I kept working then too." She held his gaze. "I'm not made of paper, Caleb." "I know that," he said. "I watched you cross a flooded creek alone to collect 11 cattle in a storm. I'm well aware you're not made of paper." Martha, at the stove, said nothing and stirred something with great concentration. "Then trust me to know my own limits," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and that was the end of it. Because that was who he was. He listened. He adjusted. He didn't make the same argument twice. She had come to understand this as one of his most significant qualities, and one that was considerably rarer than it should have been. He took his coffee to the table and sat with his morning reports. And Clara finished the bread. And the kitchen was warm and ordinary. And underneath the ordinary was the thing neither of them had yet named fully, but that both of them were now entirely aware of. It had weight, that unnamed thing. She felt it in the way she was conscious of where he was in the room. In the way he'd positioned himself near her at the counter, not because he needed to be there, but because he'd wanted to be. In the way Martha was performing elaborate indifference that convinced absolutely no one. It had weight, and it was growing, and Clara was for the first time in this entire experience genuinely uncertain what to do with something. She was good at problems with solutions. She was good at situations with clear variables and manageable outcomes. She was less practiced at this particular territory, which had no ledger and no documents and no methodology she had previously tested. She decided to do what she always did with things she didn't yet know how to handle. Pay attention, keep working, and trust that the shape of the thing would become clearer in time. The week after the storm was different in ways that were hard to specify precisely but impossible not to notice. The ranch hands had a particular quality of regard for her, now that had not been there before. It was not the respectful neutrality she had worked for and earned in her first weeks. And it was not the warm appreciation that had come with the food and the reorganized accounts. It was something more direct. Old Pete stopped pretending that his frequent appearances near the main house were about anything other than checking on her. Tom Briggs, who had never spoken more than 8 words to her consecutively, appeared one afternoon with the repaired kitchen shelf bracket she had mentioned needing 3 weeks ago and fixed it without being asked. And when she thanked him, he turned very slightly red and said just a loose screw, "Ma'am," and left. Jake Sutter, who had started as the first resistance and become one of the most reliable presences in the dining room, actually told one of the newer hands to straighten up when the newer hand made a comment at dinner that was only borderline disrespectful. Not to Caleb. Not because Caleb was present. Because Jake Sutter had decided on his own, at some point, that Clara hadn't witnessed that this was not how things were done at this ranch anymore. She told Caleb about it that evening. She wasn't sure why she told him she'd been handling the social dynamics of the ranch largely on her own and didn't typically report small developments. But she wanted to tell him this one, and she was becoming less interested in examining all her reasons before acting on them. He looked up from his papers with the small, genuine expression she had been charting since the beginning. Jake Sutter. Jake Sutter, she confirmed. He's been here 8 years, Caleb said, with the particular quality of someone revising a long-standing assessment. I wasn't sure he was capable of that. People surprise you, Clara said. You surprised me, he said. She looked at him. He looked back with the directness that was, she had concluded, simply how he operated, no deflection, no softening, no strategic ambiguity. When he said something, he meant it. In what way? She asked. He considered the question with his characteristic seriousness, as if she'd asked something that deserved a real answer rather than a comfortable one. I knew you were capable, he said. I assessed that from the first conversation. What I didn't know was how you'd make people feel. That's harder to assess in advance. It's harder to explain now. He paused. The ranch feels different, not just better managed. Different. Like something that was only running is also living now. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's the most you've said about something that wasn't operational, she said. I'm working on it, he said simply. She looked at him across the table, with the warm lamp between them, and felt the ground shifting under the careful practical arrangement they had constructed. The way bedrock shifts slowly, inexorably, in response to forces larger than the structure built above it. She was falling in love with her husband. She had been, she suspected, for several weeks. She was only admitting it to herself now because she had run out of reasonable alternative explanations for the evidence. She did not say this to him. She was not ready for that. And she was, she realized, also not entirely sure what he felt. Despite his honesty in the barn after the storm, he had told her his investment had changed. He had told her she deserved to know. He had not used particular words, because he was not a man who used words carelessly or before he was certain of them. She respected that. She was the same way. So she held it, the thing she had admitted to herself, and went back to work and paid attention and trusted the shape to become clearer. It became clearer on a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after the storm, in a way she had not anticipated, and from a direction she had not been watching. A wagon arrived from Millbrook. That in itself was not unusual. Supply deliveries came regularly. What was unusual was the man driving it, who was not their regular supplier's hand but a stranger. And what he delivered was not supplies but a letter, which he said had come from the Billings County Court office and was addressed to Clara Dawson. Clara signed for it and opened it in the hallway. It took her 3 readings to fully understand what it said, because the language of county court correspondence was designed to be comprehensive rather than clear, and she had to move through it carefully. When she understood it, she sat down on the hallway bench, not because she was overwhelmed, because she needed a moment to be still with it. Harold Vane had been formally investigated by the Billings County Court on the basis of a complaint filed. The letter didn't specify by whom, but Clara had a strong sense regarding predatory lending practices. 3 of the 4 cases she had documented had been identified as fraudulent. Vane's lending license had been suspended pending a full review. Any agreements made under the affected arrangements were declared void. It was over. Legally, completely, officially over. Not just for her, for the other families too. The 4 she had documented, and probably more. She sat in the hallway for a long moment, holding the letter, feeling something she didn't have a name for. Not triumph exactly. Not relief, though both of those were present. Something deeper. The specific feeling that comes when a wrong that has been wrong for a long time is finally, formally corrected. Something she had been waiting for, without letting herself call it waiting. She heard Caleb's boots in the back hallway, and then his voice calling to Thomas about the Thursday delivery. And then his footsteps coming toward the front, and he appeared at the hallway entrance, and stopped when he saw her sitting on the bench with a letter in her hands. He was at her side in 4 steps. What happened? She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face as he read it, the focused stillness, the slight change around his eyes as the meaning settled in. He looked at her when he finished. He filed the complaint, he said. She looked at him. What? The complaint to the Billings court. He looked back at the letter. Someone filed it. Someone with documentation of multiple cases and the knowledge to present them in a way the court would take seriously. Clara stared at him. You filed it. I had Thomas take your documentation copies to Billings 3 weeks ago, he said. We have a lawyer there. He handles the ranch's county business. I asked him to assess whether a formal complaint was viable. He paused. He said, it was. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to tell you if nothing came of it, he said. I didn't want to give you something to hope for that didn't arrive. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had taken her documents, the documents she'd assembled over 3 days of careful work, and used them not just to defend his own ranch, but to protect the other people. Harold Vane had done the same thing too. Who had done it quietly, without announcement, without making it about his own authority or his own reputation. Who had done it for her, and for people he'd never met. Because it was simply the right thing to do. Caleb, she said. You did the work, he said immediately. The documentation was yours. I just made sure it went somewhere it could do something. That's not a small thing, she said. Neither was walking from Billings on broken suits, he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the hallway was quiet and the letter was in his hands, and she understood. In the particular way that you understand things that have been true for some time but needed a moment to become undeniable. That she was not going to be careful about this anymore. Careful had served its purpose. Careful had gotten her through the gate and through the first month and through Vane and through the storm. She had been careful enough. She was done being careful about this. I need to say something, she said. He waited. I came here with a suitcase and a broken latch and the last of my courage, she said. And you gave me a home and a wage and your name, and you did it without once making me feel that I owed you anything for it. And then you stood beside me in that hotel room and didn't intervene, because you understood that I needed to do it myself. And you rode into a flooded creek because you were frightened for me. And you sent my documentation to Billings without telling me, so I wouldn't be disappointed if it failed. She held his gaze. I have been paying attention to you since the first morning. And what I see is a man who is consistently quietly, and without any performance of it, one of the finest people I have ever known. The hallway was very still. Caleb looked at her with the unguarded expression, the one she had seen at the creek, the one that appeared when he forgot to manage it, and this time he didn't put it away, he let it stay. He held her gaze and let her see it, and she understood that this was significant for him in a way that was hard to overstate, because she knew by now exactly how carefully he kept himself. Clara, he said. I know, she said. I know the arrangement we made. I know what we agreed to. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. I'm telling you what's true for me, because honesty was the basis of this, and I'm not stopping now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, and with the certainty that lived in his chest rather than his head, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement some time ago. She held very still. I don't know exactly when, he said. I've been trying to identify it. I think it was the morning you told me about Vanin. Not because you told me, because of how you told me. You sat across from me and gave me the information I needed to make an informed decision, including the information that might have made me undo everything. Because you believed I deserved the truth more than you deserved the safety of keeping it. He paused. I haven't met many people who make that choice. Honesty is simpler in the long run, Clara said. It usually costs more in the short term, he said. Yes, she said, it does. He reached out and took her hand, not briefly. Not the way she had put her hand over his the night of the storm, but deliberately, with both of his, the way you hold something you intend to keep. He looked at her hands for a moment, and then at her face. I would like to change the terms of the arrangement, he said. Clara felt something open in her chest, wide and warm. What terms did you have in mind? The part where neither of us has to be careful about this anymore, he said. She looked at him. She thought about the gate, and the justice of the peace, and the kitchen late at night, and the barn in the storm, and the flooded creek, and this hallway. She thought about the specific shape of 30 days that had turned a desperate practical decision into something she did not yet have complete words for, but that she was entirely certain about. I think I can agree to those terms, she said. He almost smiled. Fully this time, almost. Martha appeared at the far end of the hallway, took one look at them, and turned around, and went back the way she'd come without a single word. And the sound of her footsteps retreating was so deliberate that Clara was fairly certain the woman had been listening for some time and had made the executive decision to give them the hall. Clara looked at Caleb. He looked at her. And then she did something she had not planned and would not have predicted. She laughed. Quietly, genuinely, the specific laugh that only comes when something is both absurd and perfect at the same time. He looked at her laughing, and the corner of his mouth went all the way. And it was real full and brief, and it changed his entire face. And she filed it away as the most significant thing she had seen from him yet. The shift between them after that was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was the way water becomes warm gradually, from every direction, until you realize that the temperature has changed entirely and you can't identify the single moment it happened. He started sitting closer at the dinner table, not conspicuously, just closer. She started leaving him coffee in the morning without being asked, the way Martha had always done, and he accepted it without comment, in the way of someone for whom the gesture carries more meaning than either of them is going to say out loud yet. He began consulting her on ranch decisions that were not domestic. Not because he needed her expertise in cattle operations. She had no particular expertise in cattle operations, but because he wanted her perspective. And she gave it honestly, and occasionally, she caught something he had missed, simply because she was looking at it from an angle he'd stopped using from long familiarity. She found herself learning the ranch in new ways, deeper ways. The South pasture's particular vulnerability in wet seasons. Which of the hands had family and where, and what that meant for how long they'd stay. The specific economics of the cattle market this year, and how Caleb was thinking about the next. She absorbed all of it, the way she absorbed everything systematically. With attention, fitting it into the larger picture she was always building. This was her ranch. She was understanding it as hers in a new way now. Not just through the household accounts and the kitchen and the domestic authority she had built, but through its land and its people and its long-term future. She was also, in the evenings, starting to talk to Caleb about her own past in ways she hadn't before. Small things at first. Her father teaching her to ride. Her mother's recipe book, which she had memorized before it was lost. Every page of it, because she had known from the age of 12 that she would not always have it in her hands. Her brother Daniel, somewhere west of here, whom she thought about and had mostly stopped hoping to find. Caleb listened the way he always did, completely. Without interjection, without the habit some people had of hearing your story and immediately replacing it with their own. He asked questions that were specific and real, Not the kind designed to seem interested, but the kind that meant he had been paying attention. He told her things too, slowly, in the particular way he spoke about everything personal carefully, like someone who had learned to be careful and was teaching himself, with effort, to be less so. He told her about his wife, Margaret. He didn't explain the loss or narrate the grief. He told her about who Margaret had been, the particular way she'd argued with him about ranch finances and been consistently right. Her habit of feeding the horses apples every morning like they were house pets. The way she'd made the ranch feel like a place rather than an operation. And how after she was gone, it had slowly returned to feeling like only the latter. Martha tried to keep it, he said. She worked harder than anyone should have to. But it's not, he stopped, chose the words. It's not the same as having someone who's building it intentionally. Who's invested in it beyond the job. No, Clara said. It's not. He looked at her. You gave it back, he said. What it felt like before. She held that sentence. It was the most significant thing he had ever said to her, and they both knew it. Margaret sounds like she was remarkable, Clara said. She was, he said, no qualification, no comparison. He said it, and looked at Clara, and she understood that he was holding both things at once, the loss and the present, and not asking her to compete with either. She loved him for that. She had been aware of the thing building in her chest for weeks, and had been calling it something careful and unnamed. But sitting across from him in that moment, she stopped being careful about the word. She loved him. That was the truth of it. Plain, clear, and entirely real. She didn't say it yet. She would. But not yet. She wanted him to know it when she said it was something she was certain of. Not just something true in the warm, specific feeling of a good evening. She wanted to be sure it held in the morning, and in the ordinary, and in the difficult. Not just in moments like this. She had always been a woman who needed to verify things before she trusted them completely. She was almost certain she would let herself be completely certain soon. What pushed her to completely certain was not another significant moment. It was a Tuesday morning, entirely ordinary, when the ranch was running its usual operations, and she was reviewing the winter supply projections, and she heard an argument outside between two of the newer hands that was escalating toward something requiring intervention. She went out. She handled it not dramatically, not by asserting authority from above, but by walking up to the two men and saying, plainly and without heat, "This isn't the way we do things here. Whatever the problem is, bring it to me this afternoon, and we'll sort it out properly. Right now, both of you get back to work." They went. Just like that. Because she said so. She turned around and found Caleb standing at the barn entrance, watching. He had seen the whole thing. "You didn't need me," he said. "No," she said. "I wasn't worried that you would," he said. He paused. "I keep thinking about what I said to you at the gate. That I needed a wife, not a worker." She looked at him. "I remember. I thought I knew what I needed," he said. "I thought it was practical. Someone who could run things. Someone who could manage the household and give this place some order." He looked at her with the full directness of his gray eyes. "I had no idea what I needed. I only know now because you showed me." Clara stood in the yard in the morning light with the ranch running around her and looked at this man, her husband, the word finally feeling like exactly what it was, and said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. "I love you," she said. Plain, clear, direct. "I have been certain of it for long enough now that I'm sure it isn't just a feeling. It's a conclusion, and I wanted you to know." He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the yard in 4 steps and took her face in his hands. The careful, strong hands of a man who had been carrying everything alone for 6 years. And he looked at her like she was something he had not let himself believe he would find again. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right time to say it. And I've concluded there isn't a right time. There's just now. Now is fine," she said. "Now is good." He kissed her, briefly, gently, with the particular quality of something that has been earned rather than seized. And the yard was sunny, and the ranch was running, and somewhere behind them, Eddie Pruitt made a sound that was enthusiastically supportive and immediately suppressed when Caleb looked at him over Clara's shoulder. "Go check the east fence, Eddie," Caleb said. "Yes, sir, absolutely, sir," Eddie said, and practically ran. Clara laughed. Again, the real kind. Caleb looked at her laughing, and something in him, something that had been very carefully held for a very long time, came finally loose. They stood in the yard together for another moment, her shoulder still aching and his shirt still dusty from the morning's work. Entirely ordinary and entirely happy in the particular way that happens when you have built a thing carefully and truly, and it holds. Inside, Martha looked out the kitchen window, looked away. Put the kettle on, she'd known since the first week. She had the patience to wait for people to catch up to what was already true. She made the tea and hummed something under her breath and did not mention it to anyone, which was exactly what the moment called for. That evening, they sat at the dinner table with the full complement of ranch hands. And the conversation flowed the way it had come to flow, easy, warm, real, and old Pete told a story about a storm 20 years back that somehow became a story about a horse who had opinions. And Jake Sutter argued a point about fence posts that turned into general laughter. And Martha came through with the pie that was becoming genuinely famous in the county and set it down like she was placing something sacred. Clara sat at the table that was her table now, in the home that was her home, next to the man who was her husband in every sense of the word. And she looked around at these people who had become her people. And she felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its specific quality. She felt safe. Not the fragile safety of charity or tolerance or useful employment. The kind that is built, the kind that is real because it was earned and tested and held. She reached under the table and put her hand briefly on Caleb's. He turned his over and held it for a moment, then let go. Because supper was on the table and there was pie. And they had time. They had all the time in the world now. That was what she had not known, walking through the gate with a broken suitcase latch and the last of her courage. That this was where the road ended, not at a destination she had planned for or a future she had mapped. At a table at home, among people who had learned, as she had, what it meant to be somewhere that had made room for exactly who you were. And outside, the Montana evening settled over the Dawson Ranch. And inside it glowed, and the difference between those two things was the woman who had walked through the gate and never left. 3 months after Clara Whitfield walked through the gate of the Dawson Ranch with a broken suitcase latch and the last of her courage, she sat at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning and did what she did every morning. She made a list. The list was not remarkable to look at. Supply orders for the week. The bread schedule. A note to follow up with the Millbrook merchant about the November contract. A reminder to speak with Thomas about rotating the winter grazing. Ordinary things. The infrastructure of a life that was running well. What was remarkable was not the list itself, but the fact that she was writing it in her own kitchen. In her own house. At a table that she had come to know the way you know the grain of something real, every mark on its surface. Every particular quality of the light on it at different hours. This was hers. Not by desperation, not by arrangement. By belonging. She heard Caleb's boots on the stairs. She had learned the sound of his footsteps the way you learn a language you plan to speak for the rest of your life. And she poured his coffee before he reached the kitchen. And he came in and picked it up and said, "What's on the list today?" And she told him. And he sat across from her and looked at the week, the way they had started, looking at everything together. As a matter of course, as if it had always been this way. It had not always been this way, but it felt already as if it should have been. That was the particular quality of a right thing. It didn't call attention to itself, it simply fit. Thomas wants to talk about the South Herd rotation before noon, Caleb said. I'll have the supply order finished by then, Clara said. I want to sit in on that conversation. He looked up. The grazing rotation. I've been looking at the land use records for the last 4 years. There's a pattern in where we're losing ground that I think connects to the rotation schedule. She sipped her coffee. I might be wrong, but I want to hear what Thomas says before I decide. Caleb looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to know as his particular version of admiration, not effusive, not performed, just a quality of attention that meant he was seeing her clearly and liking what he saw. I'll tell him 10 o'clock, he said. That was their morning. Ordinary, functional, warm. The kind of morning that people who have never been without a home take for granted, and that Clara would never, as long as she lived, take for granted. She was still writing the list when Martha came in 20 minutes later and looked at the two of them at the table with the 2 coffee cups and the list between them and made a sound that in Martha's considerable vocabulary of sounds meant something close to satisfaction. The Henderson woman came by yesterday afternoon when you were out with Thomas, Martha said, addressing Clara with the businesslike directness she used when she was delivering information she considered important. She wants to know if you'll teach her the bread. Clara looked up. Which Henderson woman? The younger one. Ruth. She's been married 2 years to that man out on the creek road, and she doesn't know the first thing about bread that doesn't come from a bag of flour and guesswork. Martha poured her own coffee. She's not the first to ask. I've had 3 inquiries in the last month. Clara set down her pen. 3 women have asked about the bread and the preserves, and whatever it is you do with the beans that makes old Pete behave like he's been given a gift. Martha sat down with her coffee and looked at Clara with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from the sharp-eyed skepticism of their first meeting. People talk. Word gets around about what's coming out of this kitchen. The Henderson girl isn't the only one who's noticed. Caleb, who had been listening with the quality of attention he brought to things that interested him genuinely, said you could teach them. Clara looked at him. If 3 women have already asked and Martha says word is getting around, he said, there are probably more who want the same thing and haven't found the way to ask it yet. He picked up his coffee. You could do something with that. I already have a kitchen to run, Clara said. You run it in your sleep, he said, without flattery. As simple observation. You've freed up enough of Martha's time that she'll tell you herself she's not stretched the way she was. You reorganized the domestic operations in the first month, and they've been running on the structure you built ever since. He paused. What I'm saying is that you have capacity. Martha, who was supposed to be staying out of this, said he's right. Clara looked between them. You've discussed this. We've observed it, independently, Martha said, in the tone of someone drawing a precise distinction. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking not about whether it was possible, because she could see immediately that it was, but about what it meant. About what it would be to open the kitchen, not just to the ranch, but to the women around it. About what it would mean to take the knowledge her mother had given her and pass it on, deliberately, to people who needed it. Her mother had said that bread was about patience, that you couldn't rush it, that the dough knew when you weren't paying attention. Her mother had also said that the best things you know are the ones you didn't keep to yourself. I'll talk to Ruth Henderson, Clara said. Martha made the satisfaction sound again and drank her coffee. The first teaching morning happened 2 weeks later. Ruth Henderson was 23, small and serious, with the particular anxiety of a young woman who had been told in various ways that she was not particularly competent and had begun to believe it. She came to the kitchen door with a determined expression that Clara recognized from the inside, and Clara brought her in and showed her where to stand and said, we'll start with the dough. What happened in the next 3 hours was not, in its mechanics, extraordinary. Clara taught a young woman to make bread. She explained the temperature of the water, the feel of the dough when it had been worked enough, the particular quality of the surface when it was ready. She taught through demonstration, and then through letting Ruth do it herself, correcting gently, explaining why rather than just what. What happened underneath the mechanics was something else. Ruth Henderson arrived nervous and uncertain and left standing differently. Straighter, with the particular posture of someone who has done something they weren't sure they could do and discovered that they could. "You'll practice," Clara said when Ruth was putting on her coat. "It'll be wrong a few times before it's right. That's not failure. It's the process." Ruth looked at her. "My mother-in-law told me I'd never be any good at running a house," she said. It came out plainly, like a fact she'd been carrying. Clara looked at her. "Your mother-in-law wasn't in my kitchen this morning," she said. "I was, and I'm telling you what I saw, which is someone who pays attention and follows instruction and adjusts when corrected. Those are the only things you need." She held Ruth's gaze. "The bread will come. Keep your hands in it." Ruth Henderson's left. Clara stood at the kitchen counter and was quiet for a moment. Martha, who had been present for all of it, working at the other end of the kitchen, said without turning around, "That's what you do." "What?" Clara said. "Feed people," Martha said. "Not just the food. The other thing." She turned around and looked at Clara directly. "Your mother taught you that." Clara felt it, the particular ache of missing her mother, which had not gone away and probably never would, alongside the specific warmth of knowing that the thing her mother had given her was still traveling forward in the world. "She did," Clara said. "Good woman," Martha said, with simple finality, and went back to work. Ruth Henderson came back the following week. She brought her neighbor, a woman named Grace Alcott, who had been farming with her husband outside Millbrook for 6 years and had, according to Ruth, the best kitchen garden in the county and no idea what to do with most of what came out of it. Grace came in with a bushel basket of late-season vegetables and a look that suggested she had been talked into this against her better judgment and was reserving the right to regret it. By the end of the morning, she was showing Clara the particular method her grandmother had used to prepare dried beans that Clara had never encountered, and they were arguing pleasantly about whether or not garlic should go in at the beginning or the end. And Ruth was watching them with the expressions of someone who has introduced 2 people at a party and can already tell it was the right call. The Tuesday morning kitchen began without anyone naming it. It simply became the thing that happened, women coming to the Dawson Ranch kitchen on Tuesday mornings. Sometimes 2, sometimes 5, sometimes as many as 8 crowded around the large table, bringing things they knew and learning things they didn't, talking the way women talk when they're not being observed by anyone they need to perform for. Clara taught. She learned. The 2 were not, she had always understood, separate activities. She learned that Grace Alcott's husband had been unwell for 2 seasons, and she was running the farm herself with the help of her 15-year-old son, and had not told anyone because she was afraid of what it would mean if people knew. Clara made a note of this and spoke to Caleb that evening. And the following week, 2 of the Dawson Ranch hands happened to spend a day fixing the Alcott's north fence, which had needed it for months, and when Grace asked how that had happened, nobody had a clear answer. She learned that a woman named Adeline Marsh, who came with Ruth on the 3rd Tuesday and said almost nothing the entire morning, was living in a situation that reminded Clara uncomfortably of her own experience with her uncle's house. She watched Adeline carefully. She didn't push. She made sure Adeline knew where the kitchen was and that Tuesday mornings were standing. And she made sure that when Adeline finally, 6 weeks later, came to the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon instead of a Tuesday and sat down and didn't say anything for a long time, Clara was there and the coffee was warm and the kitchen was quiet. She didn't ask Adeline what she needed. She waited until Adeline said it herself. Adeline said, "I don't know how to leave." Clara set down her mug. She thought about March and broken boots and 3 days on the road. She thought about standing at a gate with a broken suitcase latch and nothing left. "Yes, you do," she said. "You know exactly how. You're just frightened," which is different from not knowing. Adeline looked at her. "You make a plan," Clara said. "You figure out what you need and where you can go and how you'll get there. Then you go." And it will be harder than the plan, and you'll be more frightened than you expected. And then you'll get through it. She held Adeline's gaze. And you'll be somewhere else, somewhere you chose. Adeline went home that Thursday. She came back the following Tuesday, and she came to Clara quietly before the morning started and said, "I'm going to my sister in Bozeman." Her voice was steady. "I leave Friday. Is there anything you need before Friday?" Clara asked. Adeline shook her head, then stopped. "Just to tell you." "I'm glad you told me," Clara said. Adeline left on Friday. Clara didn't know what happened after. But she knew the first part happened, and the first part was everything. Caleb knew about all of it, not because Clara reported to him, but because they talked. In the evenings, about the day, about what had happened and what it had meant, and what came next, and the kitchen Tuesdays were part of that. He listened. He helped where he could, quietly and without making it about himself. The fence at the Alcott farm. A supply of flour and sugar that appeared in the kitchen without comment when the Tuesday morning started needing more than the ranch's regular stores. A word to the right person in Millbrook when Clara mentioned that Grace Alcott was going to need help getting her winter root crop to market. "You're using the ranch," Clara said one evening, not as a complaint, just as an observation. "We're using the ranch," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "You're the one who sees it," he said. "What people need. I just happen to have some of the resources to help." He paused. That seems like a reasonable division of labor. She thought about the gate. About what he had said, "I want someone who will stand beside me. Someone who will share my victories and struggles. Someone who will turn a ranch into a family." He had meant the Dawson Ranch. What he was getting, she thought, was something somewhat larger than that. She didn't say this to him because she thought he already knew it and was, in his way, glad. The letter came on a Wednesday in mid-November, addressed to Clara Dawson from Bozeman. It was from Adeline, who wrote in a careful, slightly formal hand that she was settled at her sister's, that she had found work at a dress shop, that she was well. She wrote, "Near the end, I didn't know you could just leave. I thought leaving meant you'd failed. You showed me it meant the opposite." Clara read the letter twice, and then went and found Caleb in the barn and read it to him without explanation. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You should keep that one." She folded it and put it in her dress pocket and went back to the house. She kept it. She kept it in the small box on her dresser with her mother's recipes, which she had long since transferred from memory to paper because she had decided that they should exist somewhere other than inside her own head, in case the world needed them after her. The letter from Adeline. The recipes. The first supply contract she'd renegotiated. The county court letter about Harold Vane, the documents of a life rebuilt. The evidence of a woman who had come back to herself. November became December, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm, which was different from the summer slower, in some ways. Internally focused, the long evenings gathering people together in the way that cold and dark outside always have. Martha taught Clara to make her mother's ginger cake, which she had never taught anyone, and when Clara asked why she was teaching her now, Martha said, without sentimentality, "Because you'll do it right," which was the highest compliment Martha possessed. Old Pete told Clara, one afternoon when they were alone in the kitchen, and he had no apparent reason for being there, except that it had become one of the places he went, when he wanted to be somewhere warm and quiet, that the soup was his mother's soup, that she had made it the same way and he hadn't had it since she died 22 years ago, and he hadn't expected to have it again. Clara looked at him. "Rose," he said. Like he hadn't said the name in a while. Like it still meant something to say it. "I'll keep making it," Clara said. He nodded once, looked at the table, and said something about the fence and left. But he sat closer to her at dinner that night, and the distance that had never been unfriendly, but had always been there, was simply not there anymore. This was what she had not known how to explain to Caleb when he asked her what she was doing with the cooking. Those early weeks, when he noticed the change in the room and called it the ranch, feeling like something that was living rather than just running. She had not been able to explain it because she had not yet fully understood it herself. Food was memory. Food was the specific texture of being somewhere you were cared for. When she fed people well and with intention, she was not just providing calories. She was giving them back something, a feeling, a person, a time that they had lost and had stopped hoping to find again. She was doing for them what the ranch had done for her. Returning something that had been taken. The twist that came in December was not a crisis. It was a letter of an entirely different kind, and it arrived on a Tuesday morning in the middle of the kitchen gathering, which meant that 6 women were present when Eddie brought it in and said, with his characteristic total absence of subtlety, "It's from Bozeman, Mrs. Dawson, but it's not the same handwriting as the last one." Clara took the letter from him. She looked at it. The handwriting was not Adeline's. It was a handwriting she had not seen in 3 years, and she recognized it in the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you grew up reading notes from. Immediately, and in the body before the mind catches up. Her hands were entirely steady. Steady from practice. Steady from intention. Steady from 3 months of learning that she was someone who could hold difficult things without dropping them. She said to the room, "Excuse me for a moment," and went to the hallway. She opened the letter. It was from Daniel, her brother. Daniel, who had gone west before their mother passed and been lost to distance and silence for 3 years. Daniel, who she had mostly stopped hoping to find, because hope that stays unrequited long enough becomes something you put away in order to keep functioning. He had heard about her from a man who had come through his town, a supply merchant from the Millbrook area who had mentioned, in passing, the Dawson Ranch, and the woman who ran the kitchen there and had made something of a name for herself in the county. He had done the arithmetic and written to the ranch on the chance. He wrote, "I didn't know if you were still looking. I've been looking since I heard the farm was gone. I should have looked harder sooner. I'm sorry for that. I'm in Bozeman. I came there 2 years ago. I didn't know you were here." He wrote, "I'd like to see you if you'll let me. I'll understand if you won't." He wrote, at the end, in the handwriting of a man who had also been doing the kind of arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers, "I've been carrying the fact that I left before she died. I think about that every day. I think you might understand that better than most." Clara stood in the hallway with the letter and felt something move through her that was large and complicated and required more than a moment to hold properly. She stood with it. She let it be as large as it was. Then she folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went back to the kitchen. 6 women looked at her when she came back. She had learned from Martha how to walk into a room after something significant and not make the room carry it before you were ready to share it. She sat down at the table and looked at the bread they had been working on and said, "Ruth, your second loaf is ready to shape," and the morning continued. It continued until the women left, and Martha went to the garden for something, and Clara was alone in the kitchen. Then she took the letter out of her pocket and read it again. She was still reading it when Caleb came in. He read her face the way he had learned to read it quickly, without intrusion, understanding that something significant was present before she said a word. He sat down across from her without prompting. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked at her. "Your brother," he said. "My brother," she said. "Do you want to go to Bozeman?" She looked at him. He had already moved to logistics, which was his way of saying, "Whatever you need, we'll find a way." It was not avoidance. It was his particular language of support. "I want to write back first," she said. "I want to," she stopped. Started again. "I need to know he's real before I let myself believe it." Caleb nodded. Said nothing. Sat with her the way he sat with her through things present. Solid, entirely without the impulse to make it smaller so it would be easier to manage. "He said he's sorry for leaving before she died," Clara said. "Are you?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. Because he was asking a real question, and she had promised him honesty from the beginning. I understand why he left, she said. He was 20. And he was frightened, and staying was harder than going. I've been frightened too. I've made choices about it that I'm not entirely proud of. She looked at her hands. So no, I'm not angry. I think I'm just glad he's real and somewhere specific and that he was looking. Caleb reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not briefly, he held it. Write to him, he said. She wrote that night. She wrote for 2 hours because there was a great deal to say, and she had always believed in saying things completely. She told him where she was and how she had gotten there. She told him about the gate and the arrangement becoming something else. She told him about Martha and old Pete and Eddie and the kitchen Tuesdays and Adeline. She told him about Vane and the letter from the county court. She told him, I have a life here that I built from almost nothing. And I am proud of it, and there is room in it for my brother if he wants to come and see it. She wrote, I'm not angry that you left. I understand going. I also know what it costs, so come when you're ready. And I'll be here. She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing post and went to bed. And Caleb was already awake when she came up, reading by the lamp, and he put the book down and looked at her, and she said, It's done. And he said, Good. And she got into bed and he put the lamp out, and the room was dark and quiet. She lay there thinking about her mother's recipe book, about all the things that had been lost and then, improbably, were not gone entirely, were somewhere in kitchens across the county, and in a brother in Bozeman, and in the particular way bread smelled in the morning when the house was still waking up. She reached over and found Caleb's hand in the dark. He held it without a word. Daniel wrote back in 2 weeks. He would come in January, after the worst of the winter travel. He wrote, I didn't imagine you'd have built all that. I should have. I knew you better than that. He came in January. He was 30, taller than she remembered, with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes. And he stood at the door of the Dawson Ranch in the January cold and looked at her for a long moment, and then they held each other the way people hold each other when they've been apart too long and are making sure the other is real. He stayed 2 weeks. He met Caleb, who shook his hand and looked at him the way Caleb looked at everyone directly, thoroughly, making his own assessment without being swayed by anyone else's, and then said, We have a spare room. Stay as long as you need, which Daniel received with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had expected to have to earn his welcome and found it simply given. He met Martha, who interrogated him at breakfast on the second morning, and old Pete, who shook his hand and said nothing, and Eddie, who told him the entire story of the cattle in the storm with tremendous enthusiasm and significant embellishment, and Ruth Henderson, who came on Tuesday morning with Grace Alcott and 3 other women, and was startled to find a tall young man in the kitchen who looked a great deal like Mrs. Dawson, her brother Martha said from the stove. Sit down, Ruth, and stop staring. Ruth sat down. Daniel sat at the kitchen table on Tuesday mornings and watched his sister teach. And on the third morning he said to Caleb quietly, out at the barn, where they'd gone to look at the horses, She's different from when we were children. Different how? Caleb asked. Daniel thought about it. When we were young, she was always the one who kept everything together. She managed things. She made sure things ran. But she did it because she had to. Because someone had to, and she was the one who knew how. He looked toward the house. Now she does it, because he stopped. Found it. Because it's hers, because she wants to. Because she's chosen it. He looked at Caleb. She didn't always have that, the choosing part. Caleb looked at the house, too. At the kitchen window, where the light was on, and the shapes of women were moving. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was Clara. I know, he said. Daniel looked at him. You gave her that. She gave herself that, Caleb said. I just made sure nobody took it away. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the directness of a man who had been thinking about this for 2 weeks, and had decided to say it plainly, I'm glad she found you. Caleb looked at him. So am I, he said. It was as simple as that. The two of them standing at the barn in January, with their breath-making clouds in the cold air, and the house lit up behind them, and everything that needed to be said. Daniel went back to Bozeman at the end of the 2 weeks. He wrote the following month that he had found work with a land surveying company and was thinking about settling. He wrote the month after that he had settled. He wrote the month after that he had met a woman named Catherine. And the letter describing Catherine was so carefully neutral that Clara read it twice and then told Caleb that Daniel was completely done for, which made Caleb almost smile, which was she had found the highest form of humor available to him. Spring came. The ranch came back to life with the particular energy of Montana in April, everything pushing upward at once. Urgent and real. The Tuesday mornings were now sometimes 8 women, sometimes 12. Ruth Henderson's bread had become genuinely excellent, and she was teaching her neighbor on her own. Without being asked, because she had absorbed the principle without Clara having to state it. Old Pete's soup was made every 2 weeks, without exception. Clara sat at her kitchen table one April morning, writing her list, and she looked at what she had written and about who had written it. A woman who ran a household and kept accounts and renegotiated supply contracts and taught bread on Tuesday mornings and corresponded with her brother in Bozeman and had saved Adeline Marsh and documented Harold Vane and crossed a flooded creek alone for 11 cattle and had walked through a gate with a broken suitcase latch and the last of her courage and had never, not once, stopped moving forward. She heard Caleb's boots on the stairs. She poured his coffee, he came in and picked it up and looked at the list. "What's today, Tuesday?" she said. "The Millbrook contract renegotiation is this afternoon. Ruth comes at 9, and I want to talk to Thomas about the east pasture rotation before the Henderson women get here." "Thomas is already up," Caleb said. "He's at the barn." "Good." Clara picked up her own coffee. Outside, the ranch was waking up. She could hear the hands moving, the horses, the particular morning sounds of a working place that was entirely, completely alive. "I also want to plant the kitchen garden this week. The ground's ready." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug. The gray eyes, the almost smile, the full weight of his particular quality of attention that she had been learning and would go on learning. "You're going to take on the garden too," he said. "I was always going to take on the garden," she said. "I was just waiting for the ground." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was as close as he got in the morning. She had learned by now the full geography of his almost expressions. She had learned all of it that existed so far, and she understood there was more to learn. And she intended to learn all of it. That was what love was. She had decided. Not the feeling, though the feeling was real. The intention. The choosing every morning to keep learning the other person, to keep looking, to stay interested in who they were and who they were becoming, which was a different thing from who they had been when you found them. She had walked through a gate looking for work and had found something that could not have been named or anticipated or planned for, because it was not the kind of thing you could plan. It was the kind of thing you find by being honest and working hard and refusing to stop moving even when every reason to stop makes itself available. Martha came in, looked at both of them, made the satisfaction sound. "The Henderson girl is early," Martha said. "She's at the garden gate." Clara stood up, picked up her coffee, looked at Caleb, who was looking at her with the expression that still, 3 months in, had the capacity to make her understand something she hadn't fully understood before. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "I know where to find you," he said. She went. The kitchen was warm, and Ruth Henderson was at the door. And the bread was about to begin, and outside the Dawson Ranch was running under a Montana April sky. And inside it, the woman who had arrived with nothing was the reason it felt like everything. She had not come looking for love. She had come looking for a chance to prove who she was. She had gotten both, and she had earned them the only way anything real is ever earned, by showing up, telling the truth, and refusing, even on the hardest days, to be less than exactly herself. The cowboy who had said he needed a wife instead of a worker had found the one thing he hadn't known. He was missing not a manager of his household or a keeper of his accounts, but a woman who had turned a working ranch into a living home, and in doing so had turned a lonely man back into someone who laughed. And Clara Dawson, who had once dropped to her knees in the dirt at a gate with nothing but courage, now stood at the center of everything she had built, and she would never kneel in the dirt again.